The boardroom smelled like money and betrayal. 6 men in suits that cost more than Owen Mercer's monthly salary sat arranged around a glass table like a firing squad. And at the end of that table, Ava Sinclair, 30 years old, founder of a billion-dollar medical technology company, hands folded in her lap over a wheelchair she hadn't chosen, stared at a pen she hadn't picked up yet. The document in front of her was dressed up in legal language, but Owen had read enough mission briefs to know what it actually said. Surrender. 6 votes against one woman who couldn't stand up to fight back. Except she'd built everything in that room, and nobody had thought to ask whether she was finished. If you've ever watched someone hand over everything they built because the people around them decided they were no longer useful, stay with me. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Owen Mercer arrived at Hargrove Medical Center at 6:47 in the morning, which was 13 minutes earlier than his shift technically started, and about 4 hours after he'd last slept properly. He pulled his truck into the maintenance lot, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, the hospital rose gray and institutional against the October sky. Its loading docks already busy, a laundry van idling near the service entrance. He watched a pair of orderlies wheel a gurney through the sliding doors and thought, not for the first time, that this building ran like a machine that never fully stopped, just slowed down between midnight and dawn and pretended to rest. He grabbed his thermos, his work bag, and the manila folder he'd pulled from his locker the night before, and climbed out. His name was Owen Mercer. 35 years old, former Navy SEAL, 3 combat deployments, 2 commendations he'd never told anyone about, and 1 scar along his left collarbone from a fragment of something that had passed close enough to his throat that a Navy surgeon had told him he was either very good or very lucky. Owen had said he was probably just stubborn. The surgeon hadn't disagreed. He was also, as of 8 years ago and counting, a father. His daughter Lily was 8, gap-toothed, obsessed with salamanders and graphic novels, and asleep right now at the Hendersons' house 2 blocks from their apartment, where she stayed on the mornings Owen had early shifts. He'd called to check on her before leaving. She hadn't answered, which meant she was sleeping hard, which was good. She'd had a cold the week before that had kept them both up 3 nights in a row. He took the side entrance into the hospital, badged through, and headed for the maintenance office in the basement. The floor above the basement held the administrative wing, conference rooms, executive offices, the kind of carpeted quiet that felt deliberately insulated from the rest of the building. Owen passed through that level twice a day sometimes, checking the HVAC intake vents that the facilities director insisted on having inspected weekly, though Owen had yet to find anything wrong with them in 14 months on the job. He was on his way to do exactly that when he heard the voices. He almost didn't stop. It was early, and the corridor was mostly empty, and he had a list of tasks waiting, but something in the cadence of the voices made him slow. The particular quality of a room where several people are talking and one person isn't, the way that particular silence has a texture to it, like a held breath. The conference room door was ajar, maybe 2 inches. Owen could see a narrow slice of the room through the gap, dark wood paneling, the corner of a projector screen, the back of a man's suit jacket. He heard the word irreversible spoken in a tone that wasn't medical. It was bureaucratic. The difference mattered. He stopped and listened. "The medical consensus is established," the man speaking said. His voice was even and practiced, the voice of someone who had delivered difficult information before and had learned to make it sound like he was doing the recipient a favor. Dr. Harlan's assessment, Dr. Pereira's assessment, 2 independent evaluations, all consistent. The prognosis for functional recovery is negligible. That's the foundation of this conversation, Ava, not a judgment, just the baseline. A pause. "We're not asking you to stop believing in your company." A different voice now, smoother, older. "We're asking you to acknowledge reality. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, to the staff, to the patients who depend on what Hargrove and Sinclair Biomedical represent. That responsibility doesn't pause because of," another small pause, carefully chosen, "personal circumstances." Owen shifted slightly to see more of the room through the gap. He could now see the edge of the conference table, and at the near end of it, a woman in a wheelchair, positioned at the head of the table in the way you sit when you're supposed to be running the meeting, but have found yourself instead at the center of one. She was young, younger than he'd have expected in a room with those men. Dark hair pulled back, dressed professionally, blazer over a dark blouse, a single silver ring on her right hand. Her face was turned away from him, but he could see the angle of her jaw and the way her shoulders were set. Not collapsed, not defiant, just still. The specific stillness of someone who has heard something enough times to have run out of responses. He counted 6 men at the table. He didn't recognize any of them by face, but the suits and the body language read clearly, board of directors, or something close to it. One of them slid a document across the table toward the woman. Another placed a pen beside it. Neither gesture was rough. Neither was particularly gentle. "We've structured this well," the smooth voice continued. "You retain a meaningful advisory role. The compensation package is more than fair. You continue to have full access to the facility, to the rehabilitation wing, the wing you designed, Ava. None of that changes." "All that changes is the signature," she said. It was the first time Owen had heard her voice. It was quiet. Not weak, quiet. The way a person gets quiet when they're using energy to stay level. "Just the signature," the man confirmed. A third man, seated to the left, leaned forward. He was heavier than the others, with the reddish complexion of someone who spent a lot of time being irritated about things. "The longer this is delayed, the more uncertainty ripples out to the markets, to our partners. We have an offer from Crestline Medical on the table that doesn't stay open indefinitely." Owen didn't know what Crestline Medical was. He knew what an offer on the table meant. He watched the woman, Ava, reach toward the pen. Her hand moved slowly. Not from hesitation, he thought, but from the particular deliberateness of someone who has learned to make every physical movement count. Her fingers touched the pen. Owen looked down at the folder in his hand. He'd pulled it last night for a different reason. Routine, record-keeping, a discrepancy he'd noticed in the maintenance logs for the rehabilitation research lab on the 4th floor. Equipment that had been requisitioned and then logged as decommissioned 2 weeks later, before it had ever been used. Medical hardware that, according to the spec sheets he'd cross-referenced, was worth somewhere in the range of $300,000 and wasn't anywhere in the building that he could find. He'd been planning to flag it to his supervisor. He looked at the gap in the conference room door. He looked at the folder. He thought about what he was about to do and recognized that it was, by any reasonable measure, not his place. He pushed the door open anyway. 6 heads turned. The woman's hand went still on the pen. The man who'd been speaking, 50s, silver-haired, tailored suit, straightened with the particular combination of surprise and offense that Owen associated with people who were not accustomed to being interrupted. "This room is occupied," the silver-haired man said. "I can see that." Owen kept his voice conversational. He crossed the room at an even pace and placed the manila folder on the table between the pen and the resignation document. "Sign mine first." The room was very quiet for a moment. The silver-haired man's expression moved from offense to something more calculated. "Excuse me? There's a discrepancy in the maintenance logs for the rehabilitation research lab," Owen said. "Equipment logged as decommissioned that was never actually installed. I need an authorized signature to open a facilities inquiry. Since it seems like this is the decision-making table," he gestured around. This seemed like the right room. It wasn't entirely a lie. He did need a signature. He'd just intended to get it from the facilities director, 3 floors down. The heavy-set man with the ruddy complexion said, "Who are you?" "Owen Mercer, maintenance supervisor." Owen opened the folder on the table. The equipment in question was requisitioned for the Neuro-Rehabilitation Research Wing, 14 units of adaptive stimulation hardware, logged as decommissioned 13 days after delivery, before any of it was used. I can't find a disposal record, a transfer authorization, or the equipment itself. Given that the research wing falls under the medical technology division, he glanced at the woman, Ava, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "I'm guessing that's relevant to whoever runs medical technology." Silence. The silver-haired man said slowly, "That is a facilities matter. It has nothing to do with..." 14 units of neuroadaptive stimulation hardware, the woman said. Her voice had changed, still quiet, but a different kind of quiet now. The SR7 series? Owen looked at her. That's what the spec sheets say. Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, more like recognition of something she'd suspected but hadn't been able to confirm. She reached forward and turned the folder toward herself and read for a moment. Those units were ordered 8 months ago, she said. I approved the requisition myself. They were intended for the Phase 2 rehabilitation trials, the adaptive neuro-recovery program we were developing in-house. She looked up at the board members. Not at all of them. At 2 of them specifically, the silver-haired man and a thinner, quieter man seated at the far end who hadn't spoken yet. I was told the program had been suspended pending budget review. It was, the silver-haired man said. The board made that decision collectively in Q3. I don't understand why. The equipment was requisitioned before Q3, she said. It should still be in the building. Logistics issues? 14 units, Owen said. $312,000 in hardware. I've checked every storage room, every equipment bay, every dock log for the past year. It's not here. The thin man at the far end of the table said very quietly, Mr. Mercer, you seem to be implying something. I'm not implying anything, Owen said. I'm logging a discrepancy. That's my job. He reached over and closed the folder. I just need an authorized signature to open the inquiry. Another silence. Longer this time. He was watching the board members, but in his peripheral vision, he saw Ava's hand move away from the pen. She folded both hands in her lap instead and sat straighter in her chair, and there was something in that posture that reminded him of soldiers he'd known who found a second wind in the middle of bad situations. Not because things had gotten better, because they decided not to let the situation be the thing that decided for them. I think, she said, we should table this meeting. Ava, the company I founded is missing $300,000 in equipment, she said. That takes precedence over any vote. She looked at the silver-haired man with an evenness that Owen suspected cost her something. Unless someone at this table can explain where it went in the next 60 seconds, I'm not signing anything today. The meeting didn't end cleanly. Board members don't leave rooms the way ordinary people do. There's always a few minutes of low-voiced conferral, of jackets being straightened and phones being checked, of the general performance of composure from people who are recalibrating. Owen stood near the door and waited, which he recognized was not technically necessary, but which he also recognized had the practical effect of making the men move slightly faster. The last one out was the thin, quiet man from the end of the table, who paused beside Owen on his way to the door. He was closer to 60 than 50, with the particular kind of unremarkable face that Owen associated with people who had gotten good at not being remembered. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Owen for a moment, measured, unhurried, and then continued walking. Owen turned back to the room. Ava Sinclair hadn't moved. She was still at the head of the table, both hands in her lap, looking at the closed folder. The resignation document was still there too, unsigned, one corner slightly bent where someone had slid it too quickly across the glass surface. You could have just emailed your supervisor, she said. Owen didn't try to pretend otherwise. Yeah. She looked up at him then, directly, which he appreciated. She had the kind of dark eyes that were hard to read, not because they were guarded, but because there was simply a lot going on behind them. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. I used to be in a line of work where you develop a feel for what a room sounds like when something is wrong. Not illegal necessarily, just wrong. He gestured at the table. This room sounded wrong. She considered that. You were military. Navy, 10 years. And now you fix HVAC vents in a hospital. And manage a 6-person maintenance crew, he said. The vents are only part of it. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face. It didn't stay long. She looked back at the folder. The SR7 units, but the adaptive stimulation hardware. What made you pull that particular discrepancy last night? Routine audit. I cross-reference equipment logs against physical inventory every quarter. That one stood out because of the cost and because the decommission log didn't have a destination. He paused. Where should they have gone, if someone moved them? They shouldn't have gone anywhere. Her voice was level, but he could hear something working underneath it. The Phase 2 trials were the core of what this company was building toward. I designed the program myself. It took 4 years to develop the protocol. Adaptive neurorecovery, using progressive stimulation to remap motor pathways in spinal injury patients. The kind of approach that doesn't work in 3 months, doesn't work in 6. It requires commitment, resources, and time. All 3 of which are very easy for a board to cut when they're looking for a reason. When did they tell you the program was suspended? October 14th, 2 weeks after I came back from my last round of consultations with Dr. Harlan's team. She said it without expression. Coincidentally, around the same time Crestline Medical submitted their acquisition inquiry. Owen pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did it without asking, which he was aware was possibly presumptuous, but the alternative was standing in a way that felt wrong for the conversation. The board members, how long have they been positioned to push you out? She looked at him with a kind of flat assessment that he suspected she deployed on people who underestimated her. You jumped straight past if to how long. The equipment disappeared. The program got cut. They had a resignation document prepared. He met her gaze. I'm a maintenance supervisor, not an attorney, but I know what a coordinated effort looks like. The flat assessment shifted into something harder to categorize. Not warmth exactly, more like the recognition of someone who had said a true thing in a room where true things had been scarce. I built Sinclair Biomedical from 7 people working out of a converted warehouse, she said. We had 1 product and 1 patent and more debt than sense. I was 23 years old, and I had an idea that nobody else thought was viable, that medical technology should be designed around the patients who need it most, not the ones who can pay the most. She paused. 7 years later, we have 400 employees and a research division that was, until very recently, on the edge of something that could genuinely change spinal rehabilitation. And then, she stopped. The accident, Owen said. 14 months ago. Her voice didn't change. She'd had enough time with it to have learned to say it without flinching, which was its own kind of cost. Construction site visit, structural failure on the 3rd floor of a building we were evaluating for the new research campus. I was on the inspection walkthrough when the floor gave way. I'm sorry. I spent 4 months in hospital, another 8 in outpatient rehabilitation with 3 different specialist teams. She looked down at her hands. Doctor, Harlan is one of the most respected spinal surgeons in the country. His assessment is that the damage to my thoracic spine is complete and permanent. Dr. Pereira agreed. The independent evaluations agreed. She said it factually, the way you say things you have rehearsed until they can no longer make you come apart. I've accepted it. Owen watched her for a moment. Have you? She looked up sharply. I'm not questioning the diagnosis, he said. I'm asking whether you've accepted it or whether you've just run out of room to fight it. He kept his voice even, no edge in it. Those are different things. The silence that followed was long enough that he thought he'd overstepped. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully decipher. Not anger, not dismissal. Something more complex than either. You've been in this building 14 months, she said finally. I've been in it my whole professional life. I know. So you understand that what you walked into this morning is going to come back, he said. Whatever today was, it's not over. The board got interrupted, not stopped. They'll regroup. He looked at the unsigned document on the table. That paper will come back. She looked at it too. Yes, she said. It will. Owen stood and picked up his folder. He glanced at the pen, still where it had been left, still uncapped. The Phase 2 program, the Adaptive Neurorecovery Protocol. Is there documentation on the original team, the researchers who built the methodology? She looked at him carefully. Why? Because equipment goes missing, he said, but research doesn't. Not if the people who did it are still out there. He tucked the folder under his arm. I'll file the discrepancy report through proper channels. If anyone asks why I was in this room, I'll say I asked you to come in, she said. About the equipment. He nodded, moved toward the door. Mr. Mercer? He stopped. She was still looking at him, and whatever wall she'd been maintaining through the meeting had shifted slightly. Not dropped, just repositioned. Why does it matter to you, the program, the equipment, any of this? She asked it without accusation, genuinely. Owen thought about Lily at home with the Hendersons, about the salamander she'd brought home last spring in a plastic container, the one he'd made her return to the creek, the way she'd cried briefly and then asked if they could go back on Saturday to check on it, about the particular way children trusted that things would be okay if you just kept showing up. I used to work with a medical engineer, he said, in the field, not in a lab. He was part of a team developing adaptive recovery protocols for injured veterans. Good work. Genuinely good work. Program got cut because the funding dried up. Not because it failed, just because nobody kept fighting for it. He paused. He sends me emails sometimes. Updates on what the program could have done if it had kept going. Another pause. I never figured out what to do with that. He left before she could respond. The hallway was quiet. The building had woken up properly now, orderlies moving, an announcement drifting from the PA system 2 floors up. He walked the corridor back toward the maintenance wing and thought about the folder in his hand and the 14 missing units of adaptive stimulation hardware, and a 30-year-old woman sitting alone in a conference room with a pen she hadn't picked up. He thought about his daughter, who still believed, with the particular confidence of an 8-year-old, that her father could fix things. He didn't know yet what exactly he was going to fix, or whether any of it was fixable, but he knew what a room sounded like when something was wrong, and he knew how to stay in the building. The discrepancy report Owen filed that morning went through 3 layers of administrative review and came back to him by 2 in the afternoon with a notation that said, "Matter referred to compliance office. No further action required at facilities level." He read it twice, set it on his desk, and went back to work. He replaced a pressure valve on the 3rd floor. He recalibrated the humidity sensors in the East Wing storage rooms. He ate lunch in the maintenance break room at 12:40 with 2 of his crew, a younger guy named Darius who talked too much, and a quieter woman named Pat who had worked the building longer than anyone and knew where every pipe went. Owen didn't mention the morning. He drank his coffee and listened to Darius argue about a football game and thought about 14 units of missing medical hardware and a woman sitting alone at the head of a table with an unsigned pen beside her. At 4:15, as he was wrapping his shift and signing off on the day's work orders, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. Mr. Mercer. It was her. He recognized the particular quality of her voice immediately, that careful evenness that wasn't coldness, just control. I got your number from the facilities directory. I hope that's acceptable. It's fine, he said. How'd the rest of the day go? A brief pause. The board requested a follow-up meeting for Monday. Garrett, the silver-haired man you met this morning, called it a continuation of the strategic review, which is a polite way of saying they're not done. Another pause, shorter. Neither am I, apparently. I spent the afternoon going through the equipment requisition files myself. You were right about the decommission logs. There's no destination record, no disposal authorization, no secondary storage notation. The hardware simply stops existing in the records on October 29th, which is 2 weeks after Crestline Medical's acquisition inquiry arrived, she said. Yes, I noticed that too. Owen leaned back in his chair. Through the narrow window above his desk, he could see the parking lot going gray in the afternoon light, a few nurses heading to their cars, somebody's sedan with a broken taillight idling near the exit. You said the Phase 2 program, the Adaptive Neuro Recovery Protocol, that you designed it yourself. 4 years of development. The foundational research was mine. The clinical methodology was built by a team I assembled. She paused. Why? Is the team still together? Silence. Not the hesitant kind. The kind where someone is deciding how honest to be. No. When the board suspended the program in October, the team was essentially dissolved. The research director, Dr. Carmen Reyes, took a position at a university lab in Portland. 2 of the biomedical engineers left for private sector jobs. The clinical coordinator retired. Another pause, harder than the others. Marcus Webb, the rehabilitation scientist who built most of the neurostimulation protocol, he was the last one. He stayed on an additional 3 months trying to salvage what he could of the data. He left in January. I haven't spoken to him since. But the research exists, the data, the methodology. Theoretically, I own the intellectual property. The research is in our server archives. Whether it's still intact after 7 months of board-directed reorganization. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Owen was quiet for a moment. I want to look into something, he said. Give me a couple of days. Mr. Mercer, her voice shifted slightly. I want to be clear about something. What you did this morning, it bought time. That's all. The board has legal standing, they have the votes, and they have a 30-day window before the shareholder review meeting where they can call an emergency session and push the resignation through without my signature if they determine I'm unable to perform my duties. A brief pause. I've had 2 years of the best spinal specialists in the country tell me the same thing. I don't say this to be... She searched for the word. Defeatist. I say it so you understand what you walked into. I understand it fine, Owen said. Give me a couple of days. She was quiet for a moment. You're stubborn. I've been told. It's not a compliment in this context. I know, he said. 2 days. She hung up without agreeing or disagreeing, which he took as a reasonable response from someone who had learned to be careful about hope. He sat for another minute, then pulled out his personal phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in over a year. The name in his phone said Briggs, do not call drunk, which was a note he'd added after a long night in a hotel bar in San Diego 3 years ago when he'd nearly made a very different set of decisions about his life. He called the number sober and clear-headed, and on a Tuesday afternoon which felt like the right circumstances. It rang 4 times. Owen freaking Mercer, said the voice on the other end. I thought you'd fallen off the earth. Still standing, Owen said. How are you, Briggs? Terrible. My knee hurts, my landlord raised the rent, and I'm watching 3 years of grant applications go nowhere. A pause. You're not calling to catch up. Not entirely, Owen admitted. You were working with Hartwell's Rehabilitation Engineering Group before they got defunded. Adaptive Neuro Recovery Protocols. A different kind of silence. Where is this coming from? I need to know if you still have contact with anyone from that team. Briggs took a moment. Owen could hear him shift, the creak of a chair. Some of them. Hartwell himself is retired. Genuinely retired, not the kind where you're still consulting. His knee is worse than mine. But his research director, Yoon, she went to a biomedical lab at Northwestern. Still active. Another pause. What's going on, Owen? I ran into a situation, a rehabilitation research program that got killed before it finished, not because the science failed, because the funding did, or because the funding got deliberately redirected. He kept his voice even. I'm trying to figure out whether what got cut can be picked up again. For who? Owen thought about how to answer that. A patient who never got the full treatment protocol, and a company that was building something that would have mattered. Briggs was quiet for a long time, long enough that Owen checked his phone screen to see if the call had dropped. You realize what you're describing, Briggs finally said, is reassembling a scattered research team, convincing them to come back to a project they were forced to leave, and making that case to someone who has presumably already been told there's no case to make. Yeah, that's insane. Probably, Owen said. Can you get me to Yoon? Another long pause. Then, I'll call her tonight. No promises. That's all I'm asking. He hung up and picked up his work bag and went to get his daughter. Lily was awake when he arrived at the Hendersons, sitting at their kitchen table with a glass of juice and a library book about amphibians that she carried everywhere like other kids carried stuffed animals. She looked up when he came in and said, Dad, did you know axolotls can regrow their own spinal cords? With the specific energy of a kid who had been saving this information for exactly the right moment. Owen crouched down beside her chair. I did not know that. They can regrow their hearts too, like the actual muscle. The scientists are studying it. She turned the book so he could see a photograph of something pink and feathery gilled and genuinely strange looking. They think if they figure out how it works, they can help people with spinal injuries. Owen looked at the photograph for a moment. Then he looked at his daughter, who was watching him with the straightforward expectancy of a child who had just shared an important thing and was waiting for the appropriate response. That's remarkable, he said, and meant it more than she knew. He took her home, made pasta because it was Tuesday, and pasta was what they did on Tuesdays. And after she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and started building a list. The next 2 days were like running two jobs simultaneously. He worked his shift at the hospital. The maintenance work didn't pause. The building didn't care that he had other concerns. And in every break and after every evening, he worked the phones and the laptop. Briggs came through with Yoon's email by Wednesday morning. Owen wrote carefully, explained the situation without overselling it, and asked whether she'd be willing to talk. She responded in 4 hours, which he took as a good sign, and they spoke by phone that evening for 40 minutes. She was sharp and direct and asked better questions than he'd expected. And at the end she said she'd want to see the research data before committing to anything, but that if the protocol was what he was describing, it was worth looking at. He called Ava's direct line the next morning. She answered on the second ring. "I need access to your research archive," he said, "the Phase 2 data, specifically the neurostimulation protocol and the clinical trial design." A pause. "You found someone." "Working on it. I need the data first. One of the researchers wants to evaluate the methodology before she'll agree to a conversation." Another pause. Longer. "Owen?" It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed it and didn't say anything. "Even if someone looks at the data, even if the team can be reassembled, the board timeline, 30 days, he said. "You told me. The shareholder review is in 30 days. That's enough time to show progress, not a miracle. Just enough to change the argument. That's not how spinal rehabilitation works. You can't—" "I know how it works," he said. "I'm not promising you'll walk out of this. I'm promising that right now, the board's entire argument rests on the claim that you have no path forward, medically or professionally. If we can challenge either half of that, the argument falls apart." He paused. "Give me the archive access. Let me make some calls. 30 days. The silence this time was different from the others. He was starting to be able to read them. This one wasn't calculation, and it wasn't refusal. It was the sound of someone deciding whether they could afford to believe something. "I'll have my assistant send you the credentials this afternoon," she said. The archive turned out to be substantial. 4 years of research compressed into server files, dense with clinical notation and biomedical data that Owen could follow maybe 40% of, and the rest he left for people who understood it better. What he could read clearly enough was the structure of the protocol, a staged approach to neuro-recovery that combined robotic-assisted physical therapy with targeted nerve stimulation and progressive motor retraining, designed specifically for patients with thoracic spinal injuries who had completed initial acute treatment but hadn't achieved functional recovery. The kind of patients who had been told, politely and with evidence, that they were done. He pulled the sections Yoon would need and sent them to her Friday afternoon. She called him Sunday morning. "This is solid work," she said, and the flatness in her voice was the flatness of someone who didn't give compliments casually. "The stimulation sequencing is more sophisticated than what Hartwell's team was doing. Whoever designed this understood the gaps in the literature." A pause. "Is there patient data? Pre-treatment assessments?" "I can get it. Is that a yes?" A brief silence. I want to talk to the research director who built this. Dr. Reyes. Is she reachable?" "I'm working on it," Owen said. He hadn't tracked Reyes yet, but he started that afternoon. Carmen Reyes was harder to find than he'd expected. The university lab listing in Portland put him through 2 administrative assistants before someone told him Dr. Reyes was on sabbatical. He tried her published email. He tried a former colleague of hers whose name appeared in the research acknowledgments. On Tuesday, 5 days after the conference room, he finally got a phone number from a biomedical conference registration list that Briggs dug up on his end, and he called it at 7 in the evening, not entirely sure it was still current. She picked up. "Who is this?" "My name is Owen Mercer. I'm calling about the Phase 2 Adaptive Neuro-Recovery Program you directed at Sinclair Biomedical." The silence that followed had a specific texture. "How did you get this number?" "Took some work," he admitted. "Dr. Reyes, I know you left the program under difficult circumstances. I'm not calling to relitigate that. I'm calling because the woman who built the research is in the middle of a fight to keep her company from being sold out from under her, and I think the program you built is the center of it." A long pause. "Ava." Her voice changed when she said the name. Not warmer exactly, but more present. How is she? Holding on, but the board has a 30-day window and they're planning to use it. The board. The word came out flat and loaded. Did she tell you about October? What happened to the program? Some of it. I found the decommission notice on a Monday morning, Reyes said. No prior discussion, no review process, no conversation with me or anyone on the team. 14 units of hardware that had just arrived, hardware I'd spent 8 months getting approved, logged as decommissioned and removed over a weekend. When I went to the facilities team to ask where they'd gone, I was told it was under review. A pause. I escalated to Garrett directly. He told me the program had been suspended pending board review and that I should continue other work in the interim. Another pause. Harder. There was no other work. The Phase 2 trials were the entire research division. Owen listened. He let her talk, because he could hear that she needed to, and because the information mattered. I tried to reach Ava, Reyes continued. She was in the middle of a rehabilitation cycle. Dr. Harlan's team had a specific treatment window, and she was focused on that. By the time the cycle ended and I could get to her directly, the board had already put the program formally on hold. 3 weeks later, they announced the research division was being restructured. The word landed with exactly the weight she intended. I stayed 6 more months trying to preserve the data. Then I left because there was nothing left to preserve. The data is intact, Owen said. I have archive access. Yoon from Northwestern has reviewed the methodology sections and says the work is solid. Silence. Yoon is involved? She wants to talk to you before she commits to anything. What exactly are you trying to do? Reyes asked. Not hostile. Genuinely trying to understand what she was being asked to walk back into. I'm trying to buy 30 days, Owen said. Not a full clinical trial restart. Not a miracle. Just enough demonstrated progress to change the argument. If we can show the board and the shareholders that the program was viable, that it was suppressed deliberately, and that Ava's prognosis wasn't the last word, the case for forcing her out falls apart. Owen. She used his first name the way people do when they want to make sure you understand they're being serious. Spinal rehabilitation doesn't work on a 30-day timeline. The protocol was designed as a minimum 6-month program. You can't show meaningful recovery in, I know, he said, but Ava never completed the full protocol. She was pulled out of treatment early, before the Phase 2 stimulation sequences were administered. If that's still true, she's not a patient who failed the treatment. She's a patient who never received it. The silence this time lasted long enough that he checked the call again. That's true, Reyes said quietly. Her original treatment plan was interrupted. The accident happened during a critical recovery window, and then the board pushed her toward administrative return before the Phase 2 protocol could begin. A pause. If she were to start the program now, I need you to tell me whether it's still possible. I need to see her current assessments, current imaging, current neurological evaluation. Another pause, working through it. And I'd need to talk to Ava, directly. I can arrange that. And Marcus, Webb built the stimulation sequencing. The protocol doesn't work without someone who understands the architecture he designed. I'm working on finding him, Owen said. Don't work on it, Reyes said. Call me tomorrow. I'll get you to Marcus. He thanked her and hung up and sat in the kitchen quiet for a moment. Lily was asleep. The apartment was the specific kind of quiet it got after 10 at night, when the building settled and the street outside lost most of its traffic, and he could hear the refrigerator hum. He sat with his hands flat on the table and thought about what he'd just set in motion and whether it was going to be enough, and whether it was even his place to have set it in motion at all. He thought about the way Ava had said, I've accepted it, the particular tone of someone who had rehearsed a thing until it stopped feeling like a wound and started feeling like a fact. He'd heard soldiers talk that way about injuries, about things they'd lost. Sometimes the acceptance was real. Sometimes it was just the only way they'd figured out to keep getting up in the morning. He didn't know which it was for her yet. He called her the next morning before his shift. She answered from what sounded like her office. He could hear the ambient noise of a building in motion behind her, phones and footsteps, and a distant printer. I've got Reyes, he said. and a contact at Northwestern who's reviewed your research archive and wants to move forward. I need Marcus Webb. A brief silence. How did you get to Carmen? Long story. Webb, do you have a number for him? Owen. Her voice was measured, but something had shifted in it. Not the controlled evenness of the previous days, something less settled. Carmen left because of what the board did to the program. Whatever she told you about that, I should have protected the research better. I should have been there when it happened, and I wasn't because I was... She stopped. Reyes doesn't blame you, he said. She should. Maybe. But she doesn't. He kept his voice steady. Webb, do you have a number? She gave him a number and an address in Asheville, North Carolina, where she said Webb had gone after leaving the company. Back to his hometown, as far as she knew, though she hadn't spoken to him directly since January. He wrote both down. Reyes said she'd get me to him, Owen said. But yours is faster. I'm calling him today. Owen. Her voice had gone to a different register. Not softer, but more direct, the way people get when they're making themselves say something they'd rather not. What you're building here, the team, the timeline, the idea that there's still a path. I want you to understand something. I have gone through every version of hope that exists in a situation like this. I've had specialists tell me there was a chance and then revise that chance downward. I've had 3 different treatment approaches that were supposed to help and didn't. I've spent 2 years finding out where the edges of this are. A pause. I'm not saying that to discourage you. I'm saying it so that when this gets hard, which it will, you know I'm not someone who breaks easily anymore. And I'm not someone who can afford to build on something that's not real. Owen was quiet for a moment. I'm not offering you something that's not real, he said. I'm offering you something that was cut before it was finished. That's different. Another pause. This one weighted differently than the others. Call Marcus, she said. He called Marcus Webb at 9:17 that morning, standing in the maintenance corridor outside the East Wing storage room with a cup of coffee going cold in his other hand. Webb picked up on the 3rd ring, and his voice had the careful neutrality of someone who had been hurt by something institutional and hadn't entirely recovered. Owen explained who he was and what he was working on, and Webb was quiet for most of it. Yoon's in? Webb asked when Owen finished. She reviewed the archive. She wants to talk to Reyes first, but yes. And you've got archive access, the full data set. Everything that was in the server as of January. Webb exhaled. A long, slow breath that carried something complicated in it. The stimulation sequencing in Phase 2. It's not something you can implement without someone who built it. The parameters are patient-specific and the calibration takes time. You can't just read the protocol and run it. A pause. I'm not saying that to protect my territory. I'm saying it because if it's done wrong, it won't help and it might hurt. I understand that, Owen said. That's why I'm calling you. A silence, longer than the others had been. Where is Ava in her current recovery? Baseline stable. She's been in her chair for 14 months, no recent treatment. The Phase 2 stimulation sequence was never administered. Another long pause. That's a longer window than I would have expected. Webb's voice had shifted. Something had come alive in it underneath the careful neutrality. Thoracic incomplete injuries, Beak. There's a plasticity window that varies by patient, but 14 months isn't necessarily outside it, especially if she maintained the physical conditioning work. He paused. Did she? I don't know yet. I can find out. Because if she did... Webb stopped himself. Owen could almost hear him pulling back from something he didn't want to say out loud yet. I'd need to see her current imaging before I could tell you anything meaningful. Carmen Reyes is working on getting current assessments. Can you be in a room with the team within 2 weeks? A silence. Long enough that Owen's coffee was definitely cold. 2 weeks, Webb said, more to himself than to Owen. Then quietly, yeah, I can be there. Owen ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment. Down the hall, Darius was arguing with someone over a supply order. The PA system announced a department page. A cart rolled past, wheels squeaking on the linoleum. The building moved around him the way it always did, indifferent and continuous. and Owen Mercer stood in the middle of it and thought that maybe the thing about impossible situations was that they looked most impossible right before someone stubborn enough decided to stop looking at them that way. He picked up his cold coffee, drank it anyway, and went back to work. That evening, he drove to the rehabilitation center on the south side where Ava had her weekly physical therapy appointment. She'd mentioned it in passing during one of their calls, and he'd asked her assistant to confirm the address without explaining why. He sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes, debating with himself whether showing up unannounced was the right move. He decided it wasn't. Then he got out of the truck anyway. He found her in the corridor outside the therapy suite, just leaving. She was in her chair, a jacket across her lap, her assistant hovering at a professionally appropriate distance behind her. She saw him and stopped. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did, that brief recalibration, like a camera adjusting focus. "You're not scheduled for anything here," she said. "I know, I wanted to tell you in person." He crouched down slightly, not quite to her eye level, but closer to it. "Webb is in. Reyes is moving. Yoon is reviewing the data. I'm meeting with all three of them by video call Thursday evening to coordinate." Ava looked at him for a long moment. In the fluorescent light of the corridor, she looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been holding a lot for a long time. Not defeated, just carrying weight. "You've done all of this in 5 days," she said. "Most of it was phone calls." "Owen." She said his name the way she had the first time, that shift in register. "This team, if they come back together, if they look at my case, whatever they find, whatever the outcome is, I need you to understand that I'm not doing this to get my legs back." She paused. "I'm doing it because the program should exist, because there are thousands of patients who went through what I went through and were told what I was told and deserved a different answer. If the only thing this proves is that the board killed something that mattered, that's enough. That's a reason." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. "You don't believe that's enough." "I believe you mean it," he said. "I also think you're allowed to want more than just the principle." He held her gaze. "That's not a weakness." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not the wall dropping exactly, more like a small window opening in it. Then she straightened slightly in her chair and said, "The physical conditioning. You asked Webb about whether I'd maintained it. The answer is yes. 3 sessions a week, every week, for 14 months. It's the only fight I had left that felt like mine." Owen nodded. "I'll tell him." He stood. She started to turn her chair, then stopped. "There's a board meeting Monday. Garrett has requested what he's calling a progress check on the strategic review." She looked up at him. "Which means he's going to push again." "Monday is 4 days away," Owen said. "By Monday, I'll have more." She held his gaze for another moment. "You're either the most useful person I've ever met," she said, "or this is going to be a very expensive disappointment." "Probably somewhere in between," he said honestly. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the neighborhood of one, and that was the first time he'd heard anything close to it from her, and he filed it away without examining it too closely and walked back to his truck in the dark parking lot, already thinking about Thursday's call. The Thursday video call ran 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was an hour longer than Owen had planned for and exactly as long as it needed to be. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and a legal pad beside it, and watched the screen fill with 3 faces in 3 separate boxes. Yoon from her university office in Chicago, still in her lab coat at 9 in the evening. Reyes from what looked like a hotel room in Portland, a coffee cup perpetually in her hand. And Webb from Asheville, sitting in a spare room with bookshelves behind him packed so tightly that the books had started being stacked horizontally on top of the vertical rows. Owen had added a 4th tile. Ava, calling in from her home office, the frame showing a clean desk, and behind it a wall of framed patents that Owen hadn't noticed before. For the first 20 minutes, it was careful and professional, the way reunions between scientists who have been separated by institutional failure tend to be, everyone being precise, no one quite acknowledging the weight of what they were doing by being in the same virtual room again. Yoon walked through her analysis of the archived methodology. Reyes asked 2 or 3 questions that were technically about the data and were clearly also about confirming that the data was still the thing she'd built. Webb was the quietest, but when he spoke everyone listened, including Yoon, which told Owen something about the way the team had functioned when it was intact. The shift happened around the 40-minute mark, when Reyes pulled up Ava's current imaging on her screen and shared it. "I got these from Dr. Harlan's office this afternoon," Reyes said. "Current MRI, current neurological assessment, the full workup from her last evaluation 4 months ago." She paused. "Marcus, I'm sending you the stimulation mapping now." Webb was quiet for a moment while he reviewed something off-screen. Then he said, "The T7 to T8 lesion is incomplete." "Harlan classified it as functionally complete," Ava said. Her voice was level. "Functionally complete and anatomically incomplete are different things," Webb said, not unkindly. Harlan's assessment was based on clinical presentation, no voluntary movement below the injury site at the time of evaluation, but the imaging shows residual pathway integrity in the lateral columns that his treatment protocol wouldn't have addressed. He paused. "Ava, did anyone ever run a motor-evoked potential study after your initial acute treatment ended?" A brief silence. "No." "Did anyone suggest one?" Another silence, shorter this time. "No." Webb looked directly into his camera. "That's a significant gap," he said. "MEP studies measure the functional capacity of motor pathways even when voluntary movement isn't present. If your lateral column integrity is what this imaging suggests it might be..." He stopped himself, pulled back slightly. "I'd want to run the study before saying anything more definitive, but I'd want to run it." The room, the virtual room, was quiet for a moment. Owen watched Ava's face on the screen. She was doing the thing she did when something was working against her composure. Jaw set, eyes very still. The practiced stillness of someone keeping something at a careful distance. "What does the study involve?" she asked. Her voice was steady. "Non-invasive," Webb said. "Magnetic stimulation at the motor cortex, measuring signal transmission down the spinal cord. It takes about 2 hours. Uncomfortable but not painful." He paused. "I can be in the city by next Wednesday." Yoon said, "If the MEP results support what I'm seeing in the imaging, the Phase 2 protocol becomes viable. Not as a recovery guarantee. I want to be clear about that. As a therapeutic approach with a measurable evidence base." She looked at Ava's tile directly. "The critical factor is the physical conditioning you've maintained. That matters more than people realize. Motor pathway reactivation requires a neuromuscular system that's still capable of responding. 14 months of consistent conditioning work is, honestly, it's the reason this conversation is possible." Ava said nothing for a moment. Then, "I had to do something that was mine." Reyes, who had known her longer than anyone else on the call, looked at her with the expression of someone who understood exactly what that meant and wasn't going to push on it. "The protocol as designed was a minimum 6-month program," Reyes said. "Given the timeline, the board review, the 30-day window Owen described, we're not working toward full program completion. We're working toward 2 things. First, the MEP study to establish whether the pathway integrity supports intervention. Second, an accelerated initial phase, 6 to 8 weeks of combined robotic-assisted therapy, targeted stimulation, and intensive motor retraining, enough to generate measurable clinical data." "How measurable?" Owen asked. "Voluntary motor response below the injury site," Webb said. "Even partial, even inconsistent. In a patient who has been classified as functionally complete for 14 months, any voluntary movement below T7 is clinically significant." A pause. "We're not talking about walking. We're talking about signal. Proof that the pathways exist and can be activated." Owen wrote that down. Proof that the pathways exist. He thought about how to use that in a boardroom. It translated. "There's a second track," Reyes said. "While the clinical work proceeds, I've started reviewing the board documentation around the October suspension." Owen flagged the equipment discrepancy. "The 14 units of SR7 hardware. I've been cross-referencing the decommission dates against the board meeting minutes I still have access to from my time at the company." She paused, and something in her voice had gone careful and cold. "The equipment wasn't decommissioned randomly. The requisition to remove it was signed by 2 specific board members, Garrett Holloway and a director named Philip Sohan, 2 days before the official board vote to suspend the program. They moved the hardware before they held the vote that authorized moving it. The call was quiet. "That's not a procedural error," Ava said. "No," Reyes said. "It's not." "Where did the hardware go?" Owen asked. "That's what I haven't been able to establish yet. The disposal authorization lists a third-party logistics company, Meridian Asset Solutions. I can't find any record of Meridian in the company's vendor registry before October." She looked at Owen through the screen. "That's your kind of thread to pull." "I'll pull it," he said. The call wound down after that, with the specific energy of people who have found a direction and are ready to stop talking and start moving. Webb confirmed Wednesday for the MEP study. Yoon said she'd have a revised protocol framework ready by Monday. Reyes said she'd keep digging on the board documentation. Owen said he'd handle Meridian Asset Solutions and coordinate the logistics on his end. After the others signed off, Ava's tile was still on his screen, just the two of them. "How are you doing?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me after Wednesday." He nodded. "Get some sleep." "You too." A pause. "Owen." She looked directly into her camera, which meant she was looking directly at him through whatever distance separated them. "Thank you. I know I haven't said that clearly. You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "So, thank you." He closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen. Lily had left a drawing on the table, a salamander, rendered with the specific confidence of a child who doesn't know yet that salamanders are difficult to draw. He propped it against the fruit bowl and went to bed. Monday's board meeting was what Owen had expected. Garrett Holloway arriving prepared and polished, the rest of the board arrayed behind him with the particular coordinated energy of people who have held a pre-meeting before the meeting. Owen wasn't in the room. He was 3 floors below, replacing a section of copper pipe in the East Wing utility chase, and he heard about it afterward from Ava. Garrett introduced a motion to formalize a 30-day clinical review, she told him that evening, by phone. His framing was that given my stated intention to pursue additional treatment, the board had a responsibility to document the medical trajectory before the shareholder vote. A pause. "It sounds almost reasonable until you realize what it actually is." "A way to put your medical status on record before the vote," Owen said. "If the review finds what they expect it to find, they use it as evidence. And if it doesn't find what they expect, then we use it first," Owen said. "File the motion. Accept the review. Let them build the framework and then put Webb's MEP results inside it." Silence. "That's either very smart or very reckless." "Probably both," he said. "Accept the motion." She accepted the motion. Webb arrived Wednesday afternoon. Owen picked him up from the airport because it seemed like the practical thing to do, and also because he wanted to meet the man before he put him in a room with Ava. Webb was smaller than he'd expected from the phone. Compact, mid-40s, with the specific quality of a man who had spent a lot of his career in laboratories. Slightly rumpled, carrying a bag that was too heavy for a 2-day visit, wearing the expression of someone whose brain was already several steps ahead of his body. He shook Owen's hand with a firm grip and said, "How's she holding up?" "Better than she'd tell you," Owen said. Webb nodded like that was exactly what he'd expected to hear. The MEP study was conducted in a private clinical suite at the hospital. Owen had arranged the space through a contact in the neurology department. 3 favors called in and 1 awkward conversation with his supervisor about scheduling. Webb ran the procedure with a technician from Yoon's network who'd driven down from Chicago, and Owen waited in the corridor outside for 2 hours and 14 minutes, drinking bad coffee and reading maintenance reports on his phone because he needed something ordinary to look at. Reyes drove in from Portland for it. She arrived an hour into the study and sat down next to Owen in the corridor and didn't say anything for a while, which he appreciated. "She really maintained the conditioning?" Reyes said eventually. 3 sessions a week, every week. Reyes was quiet. I didn't know that. When I left, I didn't think..." She stopped. "I assumed she'd given up. On the research, on the physical work, on the whole thing, because that's what it looked like from the outside." A pause. I should have called her. She should have called you, Owen said. Reyes looked at him. You're very direct for someone who fixes pipes. HVAC too, he said. Something shifted in Reyes's expression. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. Then the door to the suite opened and Webb came out, and his face had the contained, careful look of someone holding something significant very deliberately in check. He looked at Owen first, then Reyes, then said, We need to call Yoon. They called Yoon from a small conference room down the hall, Webb's laptop open on the table, the MEP results on the screen. Owen sat to one side and didn't try to interpret the numbers. That wasn't his job here. His job was to watch the faces. Webb walked through the findings methodically. Yoon asked questions. Reyes leaned forward twice and asked Webb to repeat specific numbers, and both times her expression did something Owen couldn't fully categorize. A kind of controlled collision between what she'd hoped and what she was actually hearing. T6 bilateral, Yoon said finally. Weak, Webb said. Inconsistent, but present. That's above the lesion site. Marginally. It suggests the injury classification may have been based on incomplete assessment. The acute treatment protocol focused on T7 to T8 stabilization and didn't fully evaluate the segments above. Webb paused. More importantly, T9 right side showed a late latency response, faint, but it was there twice out of 6 stimulations. Below the lesion, Reyes said. Below the lesion, Webb confirmed. The room was quiet. What does that mean in plain language? Owen asked. Webb looked at him. It means the motor pathways below her injury site are not dead. They're suppressed. By the injury, by prolonged disuse, possibly by the neurological reorganization that happens when the brain stops receiving motor signals and starts rerouting around the damage. But suppressed and severed are different things. He paused. It means Phase 2 was designed for exactly this. The stimulation protocol is built to reactivate suppressed pathways through progressive, targeted intervention. The question was always whether the pathways were there to reactivate. Another pause. They're there. Owen wrote down the words "they're there" and looked at them on his legal pad. We start Monday, Reyes said. The next 3 weeks were the hardest Owen had worked since leaving the Navy, and the work was almost entirely logistical. Coordinating schedules, securing clinical space, managing the equipment situation, because the 14 SR7 units were still missing, and Webb needed the hardware for the stimulation sequences. Owen solved that problem by contacting the manufacturer directly, explaining the research application without mentioning the board situation, and negotiating a 30-day equipment loan that cost the company nothing because Ava signed the agreement as CEO and Garrett Holloway didn't find out about it until the equipment was already installed. That particular discovery, Holloway calling Ava's assistant in visible agitation, demanding to know who had authorized a major equipment acquisition without board approval, was one of Owen's quieter satisfactions of the month. The sessions ran 5 days a week, 2 hours each morning. The protocol Webb and Reyes had designed was aggressive by the standards of typical rehabilitation, not in a way that risked injury, but in a way that didn't allow for comfortable plateaus. Robotic-assisted leg movement to rebuild the neuromuscular memory of motion, targeted electrical stimulation at specific points along the spinal pathway, calibrated by Webb to the MEP data. Intensive voluntary motor training, Ava lying on a padded table, trying to move muscles that had not responded to conscious direction in over a year, trying again and again, while Webb monitored the response signals in real time, and Reyes adjusted the stimulation parameters based on what the data showed. Owen wasn't in the sessions. That wasn't his role, and he knew it. But he stopped by every morning before his shift, and most evenings after. Not to check progress. Webb sent him clinical updates that were thorough and unsentimental, but because Ava had told him in the parking lot that the team was the reason she could do this, and he understood that showing up consistently was a form of team that didn't require technical expertise. The first week produced nothing visible. Owen had expected that, Webb had warned against expecting otherwise, and Ava herself seemed to have calibrated her expectations carefully. She came to the sessions with the focused pragmatism of an athlete who has learned to value the work over the result, and she left them tired in the way of someone who has spent 2 hours doing something that doesn't seem to be working, but does it anyway, because the alternative is worse. The second week, on a Thursday morning, Webb sent Owen a text that said only, "Voluntary flexor response, right knee, 2 seconds, reproducible." Owen read it standing in a utility corridor on the second floor of the hospital, a wrench in one hand and a work order in the other. He read it twice. He set the wrench down and called Webb. "Tell me what that means." "It means she tried to bend her right knee," Webb said, and there was something in his voice that he wasn't quite managing to keep clinical, and it bent. Owen leaned against the wall for a moment. "How much?" "About 15 degrees, not full range. And she needed 2 previous stimulation primes before the voluntary signal got through, but the point is the signal got through." A pause. "Owen, I've been doing this for 16 years. I've worked with patients classified as functionally complete. I have never seen a voluntary motor response below a thoracic complete lesion classification, 14 months post-injury." Another pause, quieter. "This is what the protocol was designed for. This is exactly what we built it for. How is she?" A short silence. "She cried for about 45 seconds, Webb said. Then she asked us to run it again." Owen didn't say anything for a moment. "She asked me to call you," Webb added, "after I told her I was going to update you." "I'll stop by this evening," Owen said. "She said that too." He arrived at the clinical suite at 6:15. The evening crew had cleaned up. The equipment was powered down, and Ava was in the corridor outside the suite, alone. Her assistant had left at 5, and Webb and Reyes had gone to debrief at the hotel where they'd been staying. She was in her chair by the window at the end of the corridor, looking out at the parking lot in the evening light. Owen walked down and sat in the chair against the wall beside her. Not across from her, beside her, looking at the same window. "Webb called you," she said. "He did." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car pulled out of the lot slowly, its headlights coming on. 15 degrees, she said. After 14 months of nothing. 15 degrees, and it felt like... She stopped, started again. It felt like something waking up that I'd told myself was gone. Owen didn't say anything. He'd learned by now that there were things she needed to say without being responded to, and that knowing the difference was most of the work. "I built this company around the idea that people get written off too early," she said. "Patients who get a terminal prognosis and nobody fights for the exception. I gave speeches about it. I wrote papers about it. And then when it was me," she paused, "I believed them. The specialists, the assessments, the consensus. I believed them because it's very hard not to when you're the patient and everyone in the room with a medical degree is telling you the same thing." "They weren't wrong based on what they knew," Owen said. "No," she said. "They just didn't know everything." He nodded. Outside, the parking lot was getting darker. "The protocol needs 4 more weeks minimum to generate the data that'll matter in the boardroom. Webb thinks 6 to 8 sessions from now, you'll have enough voluntary response to demonstrate on camera if you need to. The shareholder vote is in 11 days. I know." He'd been thinking about that. "The vote and the clinical data aren't going to land at the same time. We need to get ahead of it on the boardroom side." She turned to look at him. "You said you were working on Meridian Asset Solutions." "I've been working on it." He'd been working on it in the gaps between everything else, and it had taken longer than he'd wanted because Meridian Asset Solutions turned out to be a company with a very small public footprint and a very deliberate legal structure. The kind of entity that existed primarily on paper and was designed to make tracing transactions difficult. "I found the incorporation records. Meridian was registered in Delaware 4 months before the SR-7 units were decommissioned. 2 members on the board of directors, both of them listed as holding companies. One of those holding companies has a beneficial ownership disclosure that lists a private equity fund." He paused. "The fund is a minority investor in Crestline Medical." The corridor was very quiet. "Philip's own," Ava said. Her voice had gone flat in a way that was different from her usual control. This was the flatness of something confirmed rather than suspected. "He's been on the board for 4 years. He came in through the Series C round with a PE connection I never fully traced." Sawan and Holloway signed the decommission authorization, Owen said. The hardware was moved to a Meridian warehouse in New Jersey. I have the logistics records, not through official channels, but I have them. He paused. Reyes is working with an attorney she knows in corporate litigation who's reviewing the documentation. Ava was quiet for a moment. They weren't just trying to get me out, she said. They were feeding the acquisition, removing the research program to reduce the company's value, or redirect it, and delivering the hardware to a company connected to the buyer. That's what it looks like. That's fraud, she said. That's what the attorney thinks. She looked back at the window. The parking lot was dark now. Owen. She said his name in the careful way she did when she was about to say something she hadn't said to anyone else. When I was in the hospital, after the accident, in those first weeks when I still thought I'd recover, the thing that scared me most wasn't the injury. It was the idea that I'd built something and it wouldn't survive without me standing upright to defend it. A pause. I thought if I couldn't stand up, literally, the work would just, she made a small gesture with one hand, dissolve, because people stop listening when they think you're diminished. Some people, Owen said. Most people, she said, and it wasn't self-pity, just accuracy. Most people, he agreed. Not all. She looked at him sideways. You're very certain for someone who didn't know my name 2 weeks ago. I knew your name after the first morning, he said. I just didn't know the rest yet. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her expression shifted in the way it occasionally did. Not the window opening he'd noticed before, but something more sustained than that. Something that was deciding to stay. The shareholder meeting, she said. If the legal documentation is ready and the clinical data can be presented even preliminarily. Reyes thinks the attorney can file for a temporary injunction against the board vote on grounds of fiduciary breach, Owen said. That buys time for the clinical data to mature. Not certain. The judge has to agree, but it's a real option. And the MEP results, the voluntary response data? Webb is preparing a clinical summary. Yoon is co-signing it. 2 independent researchers plus the originating research director. The documentation will be credible. She was quiet, working through it. He'd watched her do this before. The particular silence of someone whose mind was building something rapidly and needed quiet to do it in. It was one of the things he'd come to recognize about her. She thought in architecture, in structures, the way she'd built a company from 7 people and a patent, building framework before she built walls. The stimulation sessions, she said. I need to increase the frequency. 5 days isn't enough if we have 11 days before the vote, and we need demonstrable response. Webb will push back on that. I'll talk to Webb. Ava, I know my limits better than anyone in that room, she said, and there was something in it that was neither reckless nor fragile. Just a woman who had spent 14 months learning exactly what she could and couldn't endure, and had developed a very precise sense of the boundary. I'm not asking to be pushed past what's safe. I'm asking for 7 days instead of 5. 2 additional sessions. She looked at him. I can do it. He believed her. I'll talk to Webb with you. She nodded, and for a moment the exhaustion was visible in a way she usually managed to keep private. Not defeat, just the weight of everything she'd been carrying coming briefly to the surface, the way it does at the end of a long day when the performance of being fine can finally relax slightly. She looked like what she was, a 30-year-old woman who had built something remarkable, had it nearly taken from her twice through different kinds of violence, and was still sitting up straight in a hospital corridor at 6:30 in the evening because sitting up straight was what the moment required. Owen thought about what she'd said, that she'd built the company around the idea that people get written off too early. He thought about the speeches and the papers, the 7 people in a converted warehouse, the 4 years of developing a protocol that was designed to challenge the consensus on what was possible. He thought about a woman who had believed that for everyone except herself. For what it's worth, he said, I've watched a lot of people in bad situations, combat, medical, personal. The ones who make it through, he paused, choosing the words carefully. It's not the ones who don't feel it. It's the ones who feel it completely and don't let it be the last thing they feel. She looked at him. Is that from a military manual? No, he said. My daughter told me something like it once, about a salamander she had to return to a creek. He paused. She's 8, so it was less articulate. But the point was the same. Ava looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the way she occasionally did when something had gotten past the careful management of her expression. Then she said, "I'd like to meet her." It was a small thing to say. It landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to and sat there. "She'd like that," Owen said, and kept his voice even and looked back at the dark parking lot. 3 days later, Owen got a call from Reyes at 11:30 at night. He was asleep and answered on instinct, the habit of a decade of being on call. "I found the hardware," Reyes said. "The 14 SR7 units. Meridian Asset Solutions leased a commercial storage facility in Newark under a subsidiary name. I got the address from the logistics records you pulled." A pause. "Owen, there's more. The subsidiary is the same entity that filed a preliminary asset transfer agreement with Crestline Medical in September, 1 month before the board voted to suspend the Phase 2 program." Owen sat up in the dark. "They filed the transfer before the vote." "Before the vote," Reyes confirmed, "before the official suspension, before any of it." A pause. "The hardware was promised to Crestline before the board told Ava the program was on hold. They'd already sold it." The bedroom was quiet. Down the hall, Lily was asleep. "Send everything to the attorney tonight," Owen said. "Everything. The subsidiary records, the transfer agreement, the timeline, all of it." "Already done," Reyes said. "She's filing for the injunction first thing tomorrow." He hung up and sat in the dark for a moment, thinking about the timeline. The September asset transfer, the October decommission notice. The Monday morning Reyes had arrived at work to find her program erased over a weekend. He thought about the thin, quiet man at the end of the conference table, Soan, who had looked at Owen on his way out the door with the patient, measuring look of someone who was not accustomed to being inconvenienced and was deciding how to handle the inconvenience. He thought about what it meant to build something with 7 people in a warehouse and then watch the people you'd trusted to protect it make arrangements to sell it before they even bothered to tell you it was gone. He called Ava. She answered in 2 rings, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. "Reyes found it," he said. "The transfer agreement, September." A silence. "Before the vote." "Before everything." Another silence, longer. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular flatness of someone absorbing something they had already half known but hadn't let themselves say out loud. "I trusted Soan," she said. "He was the one who pushed for the Series C round. He said he believed in the research." A pause. "He was setting up the sale." "The injunction files tomorrow," Owen said. "The attorney thinks the timeline documentation is strong." Silence. "Ava? I'm here." A pause. "I had a voluntary response in both legs today. Webb ran a secondary stimulation sequence this afternoon. Right knee 15 degrees, left knee 11, both reproducible." A beat. "I didn't tell you earlier because I wanted to be sure it wasn't a fluke." He closed his eyes for a moment. "It's not a fluke." "No," she said quietly. "I don't think it is." Outside his window, the city made its ordinary nighttime sounds. Traffic, a dog somewhere, the distant hum of something mechanical. The world not pausing for any of it, which was both the hardest thing about bad situations and occasionally the most useful. The clock kept moving regardless. The question was always just what you did with the time you had. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too." A pause. "Owen, the thing you said in the corridor about people who feel it completely and don't let it be the last thing." She paused. "I've been thinking about that." "Yeah?" "Yeah, if the vote proceeded, and judges didn't always agree on timelines that corporate attorneys considered urgent. What the filing did immediately, and certainly, was force the board to respond, to produce documentation, to put their version of events on record before the shareholder meeting rather than after. It changed the shape of the next 8 days from a countdown to a confrontation. Diana called Ava at noon with the update. Ava was in the middle of a stimulation session. Webb had agreed to the increased frequency after a conversation that Ava had described to Owen as productive but uncomfortable. And she called Owen back at 12:40 from the clinical suite, still in her therapy clothes, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone running on less sleep than they should be. The judge assigned is Margaret Okafor, Ava said. Diana says she has a background in corporate governance cases. The preliminary hearing is Monday morning. Same day as the shareholder meeting, Owen said. 2 hours before it. A pause. Diana thinks that's actually useful. If Okafor grants even a temporary delay pending full hearing, it pushes the vote back and gives us more time for the clinical data to develop. If she doesn't, Ava paused, then the vote proceeds as scheduled and we go in with what we have. What do we have as of today? Webb's clinical summary is complete. Voluntary motor response documented in both legs, reproducible across 6 consecutive sessions. MEP data, baseline comparison, full protocol documentation co-signed by Yoon. She paused. Reyes has the transfer agreement, the Meridian Incorporation records, the subsidiary connection to Crestline, and the timeline showing the asset transfer was arranged before the board vote. Diana has all of it. That's a lot, Owen said. It's enough to make a case, Ava said. Whether it's enough to win one depends on Monday. He heard something in her voice that wasn't doubt exactly. She'd moved past the particular brand of doubt that had been sitting on her in the conference room 3 weeks ago. This was something more like controlled tension, the way a structure sounds when it's bearing load and holding, but you can hear it working. How are the sessions going? He asked. A brief pause. This morning I lifted my right foot off the platform, both feet clear of the surface. 3 seconds. Another pause. Webb made a sound I've never heard a researcher make before. Reyes had to leave the room for a minute. Owen sat with that for a moment. 3 seconds, he said. 3 seconds, she confirmed. Not walking, not standing, just 3 seconds of my feet not touching anything while my legs did what I told them to. A pause, quieter. 14 months, Owen. I know. I know you know. Her voice shifted slightly, the way it did when she was letting something through rather than managing it. I keep thinking about what Webb said in the first call, that the pathways were there, they were just suppressed, and I think about every specialist who looked at the same imaging and concluded they weren't. She paused. They weren't wrong, they just stopped looking before they found the right question. The right question being whether functionally complete and actually complete are the same thing. Yes, a pause. I spent 2 years believing the answer was yes, because they told me and because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative being that there was still a fight worth having. The alternative, she said carefully, being that the person I'd been before the accident, the one who didn't accept consensus without pushing on it, had somehow decided not to apply that standard to herself. Owen didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. Get through the weekend, he said after a moment. Monday handles itself when we get there. The weekend was not, in the end, something that simply passed. Saturday morning, Owen's phone rang at 6:45 with Reyes's number, and he was already awake because Lily had climbed into his bed at 6 with her salamander book and a question about whether axolotls felt pain, which had led to a 20-minute conversation he hadn't been prepared for at dawn. Holloway's attorney responded to the injunction filing, Reyes said. Diana forwarded the response this morning. They're arguing the filing is frivolous, standard pushback, but they attach something. A pause that had weight in it. They have a counter-declaration. A physician's statement arguing that the voluntary motor responses documented in Webb's summary are within the range of involuntary reflex activity and don't constitute genuine volitional movement. Owen was quiet for a moment. Who signed it? A Dr. Alan Voss, neurologist, private practice, Chicago. Does Diana know him? She's looking into him now, but Owen, they filed this at 6 in the morning on a Saturday. They got a neurologist to produce a counter-declaration overnight. A pause. They're not treating this as a nuisance filing. No, Owen said, they're not. He called Webb at 7. Webb had already seen the response, Diana had sent it to the full team, and his reaction was the contained, focused anger of a scientist whose work has been dismissed by someone who hasn't done the work. Voss's argument requires him to have reviewed the raw MEP data, Webb said. The data that Diana submitted as part of the injunction filing, which means he had maybe 5 hours to review 16 sessions of electrophysiology, cross-reference it against the patient's baseline, and produce a declaration concluding it was reflex activity. A pause. That's not a clinical analysis. That's a legal instrument. Can you counter it? I can demonstrate that the response characteristics are inconsistent with reflex activity in about 15 minutes if I'm in front of a judge with the data, Webb said. Reflex responses have specific latency windows. What we recorded is outside those windows by a margin that isn't ambiguous. A pause. Get me in front of the judge Monday morning. I'll tell Diana. He told Diana, who said she'd already been thinking along the same lines, and who added that the fact the board had moved to counter the clinical evidence directly, rather than arguing only the corporate governance angle, was itself informative. They're scared of the medical data, she said. If they weren't, they'd ignore it. They're not ignoring it. Good, Owen said. It also means Monday is going to be ugly, she said. I want you to be prepared for that. Holloway has resources, and he's been doing this a long time. The shareholder meeting is at 2 in the afternoon. Whatever happens in Okafor's courtroom at 10, the meeting proceeds unless we get an explicit delay order. So we prepare for both, Owen said. We prepare for both, she agreed. Saturday afternoon, Owen picked up Lily from a friend's birthday party and took her for pizza because it was Saturday and pizza was what Saturdays were for, and she spent most of the meal telling him about a game they'd played at the party that involved water balloons and a scoring system she explained 3 times without it becoming clearer. He listened and asked questions and didn't think about Monday, mostly. She ate 2 slices and part of a third, and then pushed the third aside and looked at him with the direct, unguarded assessment that children deploy without warning. You're doing the thing where you're here, but thinking about somewhere else, she said. I'm here, he said. You're here, but your brain is somewhere else. She said it without accusation, just observation. Is it the lady from the hospital? Owen looked at her. Why do you think it's about someone from the hospital? Because you talk about the hospital differently now, she said, with the logic of an 8-year-old who had been paying close attention to her father for 8 years. Like it matters more. He was quiet for a moment. There's a situation at work that I've been helping with, he said. It's complicated, but it's important. Important like a mission? He'd told her some things about his military years carefully, in versions appropriate for a child, enough for her to understand why he'd done it and what it had cost and why he'd chosen to come home and do something quieter. She held on to the framework of mission as a category for things that mattered enough to take everything you had. Kind of like that, he said. She considered this. Then, is the lady going to be okay? Owen looked at his daughter, who was watching him with the complete, uncomplicated seriousness of a child asking a real question. I think so, he said. Do you like her? Lily. That's not a no, she said, and picked up her pizza. Sunday he spent at his kitchen table with the full documentation package. The timeline Reyes had built, Webb's clinical summary, Diana's legal filings, going through it the way he'd gone through mission briefs in another life, looking for gaps and weak points and things that could be used against them before they could use them first. He found 2 things he hadn't fully considered. The Series C investment documentation that showed Soan's entry into the board, which predated the Crestline connection by 18 months, and suggested the arrangement had been built over time rather than opportunistically. And a board meeting transcript from 6 months before the accident in which Holloway had proposed a strategic partnership evaluation with an unnamed medical technology company, which Ava had voted down. He sent both to Diana at 4 in the afternoon with a note. She called him back in 20 minutes. Where did you find the transcript? Board archive. Ava gave me access to the company records for the equipment inquiry. The transcript was in the governance folder. The 6-month prior proposal is significant, Diana said. It establishes premeditation. They were looking for a way to move toward acquisition before the accident even happened. The accident just gave them an accelerant. A pause. Owen, this is good. This changes the character of the case from opportunistic fraud to systematic. Will it matter Monday? Everything matters Monday, she said. Bring what you have. He was at the clinical suite at 7 Sunday evening for what Webb had decided would be a light session. Not the full protocol, just a calibration check and some low-intensity stimulation to maintain the progress without burning out Ava's neuromuscular system the night before the most consequential day she'd had in 2 years. Owen sat in the corridor and read through his documentation again. And at 8:15, the suite door opened and Ava came out, and she was moving differently, not dramatically, not in the way that would be visible to someone who didn't know what to look for. But Owen had been watching her move for 3 weeks, and he saw it. A slight resistance in the way she used her chair, as if some part of her was doing work that the chair was supposed to be doing for her, as if there was something in her legs that was participating in the motion even when it wasn't fully in charge of it yet. She stopped beside him and looked at the folder in his hands. "How bad is it?" "It's not bad," he said. "It's complicated. There's a difference." She made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It came more easily now than it had 3 weeks ago. He told her about the board meeting transcript, the premeditation angle, Diana's read on it. She listened with her hands in her lap and her face doing the architecture building thing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Holloway proposed the partnership evaluation at the November board meeting," she said. "I remember it. He framed it as routine strategic exploration. I voted it down because we were in the middle of the Phase 2 development, and I didn't want acquisition conversations distracting the research team." A pause. He didn't push back, he just noted my objection and moved on. She looked at the folder. That was 6 months before the accident, and 8 months before Sohan introduced the Crestline inquiry. "They were patient," Owen said. "They were waiting for something to change my position," she said. "The accident changed my position, or they thought it did." A pause, harder. "They were probably right for a while." He looked at her. She was looking at the window at the end of the corridor, the dark parking lot beyond it, the ordinary, unremarkable view she'd been looking at from this spot for weeks now. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She turned her chair slightly toward him. "Webb wants to talk to you about something. He wouldn't tell me what." "I'll call him tonight." He called Webb from the parking lot. Webb picked up immediately, which was unusual. He was typically in bed by 9, the schedule of a man who had spent decades keeping laboratory hours. "The robotic leg braces," Webb said without preamble. "The RS4 model. We have a set in the clinical suite. They were part of the original hardware loan." "I know them," Owen said. He'd helped install the equipment. "They're designed for patients with partial lower limb function, motorized joint assist, adaptive response to voluntary signal. They amplify whatever voluntary movement is present and fill in the gaps with mechanical support." A pause. "Ava's voluntary response has reached the threshold where the braces would be functional. Not just therapeutic, actually functional." Owen stood in the parking lot. The evening was cold, October settling into November. What does functional mean in that context? "It means," Webb said carefully, "that with the braces fitted and calibrated to her current MEP data, she could stand, possibly walk, with support and assistance. Not freely, not without help, but upright, on her own legs, doing most of the work herself." A pause. "I wanted to tell you before I told her because I wanted your read on the timing." Owen understood immediately what Webb was asking. Tomorrow was not just a medical milestone. Tomorrow was a boardroom and a courtroom, and 2 years of people who had looked at Ava Sinclair and decided what she was and wasn't capable of. "Have you fitted her with them yet?" "No, I wanted the conversation first." "Have the conversation with her tonight," Owen said. "She gets to decide." I know she does," Webb said. "I'm asking whether you think she can handle what it means. Not medically. She can handle it medically. I mean," he paused, searching for how to say it. "If she stands up tomorrow in that meeting room and it's the first time she's been on her feet in 14 months, in front of people who have been using her chair as a metaphor for incompetence, that's a significant moment. I want her to be doing it because she wants to, not because it's strategically useful." Owen was quiet for a moment. He thought about what Ava had said in the corridor, about wanting her feet to clear the platform because her legs did what she told them, about what it felt like when something you'd told yourself was gone turned out to be only sleeping. He thought about the company she'd built and the protocols she'd designed for patients who got written off and the 2 years she'd spent quietly, stubbornly maintaining her physical conditioning because it was the only fight that still felt like hers. She's been making decisions about what she can handle for 2 years without anyone asking her first, Owen said. Tell her, then trust her answer. Webb called Ava that night. Owen didn't hear how the conversation went until the next morning. He arrived at the courthouse at 9:15. Diana was already in the lobby with her associate and a cart of documents, wearing the expression of someone who had been there since 7 and was running on preparation and coffee. Webb was there too, in his best jacket, which looked like his second-best jacket, but Owen didn't say anything. Reyes arrived at 9:30 with printed copies of everything the team had produced. The hearing before Judge Okafor ran 45 minutes. She was in her 60s, with reading glasses on a chain and the specific quality of a federal judge who had heard every version of corporate urgency and was not moved by urgency on its own. She let Diana present, let the board's attorney respond, asked 4 questions that cut precisely to the points that mattered, and then said she was not prepared to grant a full restraining order, but was granting a 6-hour postponement of the shareholder vote pending review of the medical documentation, and that she expected both parties' medical representatives to be available for a full evidentiary hearing within the week. 6 hours. The 2 o'clock meeting became 8 o'clock. Holloway's attorney made an objection. Okafor looked at him over her glasses with the expression of someone who had already moved on and was mildly surprised he hadn't noticed. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Diana said, 6 hours is enough. For what? Reyes asked. For the meeting to happen on our timeline instead of theirs. She looked at Owen. How's Ava? I haven't talked to her this morning, he said. He'd sent a text. She hadn't responded, which could mean anything. He found out at 1:15, an hour before the originally scheduled meeting time, when his phone buzzed with a message from Ava's assistant that said, She's at headquarters, conference room B. She'd like you to come. He drove across town and badged into the building. He had a visitor pass from the research wing access Ava had arranged weeks ago, and took the elevator to the 4th floor where the executive conference rooms were. The building had a specific quality today that he noticed in the lobby and again in the elevator. Attention in the way people moved, the way conversations dropped slightly when he passed, the particular alert stillness of a workplace that knows something significant is about to happen and doesn't know which direction it's going to go. Conference room B was at the end of the administrative wing, smaller than the room where he'd pushed open a door 3 weeks ago with a manila folder. Through the glass panel beside the door, he could see Reyes and Webb, and a woman he hadn't met who turned out to be from Diana's office, and Ava. Ava was standing, not in the dramatic, triumphant sense. She was upright, beside her wheelchair, both hands resting on the conference table in front of her, the robotic braces visible below her pants. Matte black, fitted along the length of her legs, a quiet mechanical structure that was doing some of the work and letting her do the rest. Her posture was careful and deliberate, the posture of someone who is very aware of their center of gravity and has decided to hold it anyway. She was looking at something on the table when he came in and looked up when the door opened, and the expression on her face was not triumph either. It was something more complicated and more real than that. Concentration and effort, and something underneath both of those that was the closest thing to peace he'd seen on her face since the morning he'd met her. You didn't text back, he said. I was busy learning to stand up, she said. He looked at her, upright, steady, tired in the way of someone who had been doing something physically demanding all morning, hands on the table but not leaning on it significantly. 14 months. How does it feel? Strange, she said, and right at the same time. A pause. Webb had to recalibrate the braces 3 times this morning. The voluntary signal kept outpacing his initial settings. Webb, from across the room, said, It's a good problem to have. Owen set down his bag and crossed to the table. He stood beside her, not crowding, just close enough to be there if the geometry of the moment required it, and looked at the documents spread on the table. Timeline, clinical summary, financial documentation, the board meeting transcript, everything they'd built in 3 weeks laid out in order. The meeting is at 8, he said. Yes, we have 6 hours. I know. She looked at the documents. I've been going through the shareholder list. There are 23 institutional shareholders and 11 individual major holders. The institutional block is the vote that matters. If they hold together with the board, the individual holders can't stop it. She paused. I've been on the phone since 7 this morning. 3 of the institutional holders have already said they want to see the documentation before the meeting. That's 3 you didn't have yesterday. That's 3 who aren't committed to the board position, she said, which was a more precise way of putting it. There's a difference, she paused. The Crestline connection, when the institutional holders understand that a board vote to remove me was designed to facilitate a below-market acquisition that would benefit 2 specific board members at the expense of shareholder value. She stopped. They're fiduciaries. That argument lands differently with fiduciaries than anything else. Diana needs to be on those calls, Owen said. Diana's been on the calls with me. A small pause. She's very good. I know. I hired her. He paused. I found her. Ava looked at him sideways. You found a corporate litigation attorney in between fixing HVAC vents. Reyes found her. I provided context. The afternoon had a quality Owen recognized from operations. The specific texture of the hours before something, when preparation gives way to waiting, and waiting is its own kind of work. They went through the documentation again. Diana joined by phone for an hour, walking through the shareholder meeting procedures, the points at which Ava would have the floor, the order in which the evidence should be presented for maximum effect. Webb and Reyes ate sandwiches at the conference table and argued mildly about the stimulation calibration data in the way of 2 scientists who fundamentally agree but enjoy the friction of disagreement. At 4 o'clock, Ava sat back down. Not because she was failing, she sat deliberately, the way you sit when you've been standing for 3 hours and have chosen to preserve what you have for when it matters most. She looked at Owen across the table and said, "Tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this." He thought for a moment. My daughter thinks axolotls can teach us how to help people with spinal injuries. Ava looked at him. Is she right? Apparently there's research. I know there is, Ava said. We looked at the axolotl regeneration mechanism in the early phase 1 research. The biochemical pathway is too different for direct application, but the functional principle, inducing quiescent neural tissue to reactivate, is directly relevant. She paused. How old is she? 8. And she's reading about axolotl neurobiology. She's reading about salamanders generally. The neurobiology came up in the context of why they're interesting. She sounds like she was raised by someone who takes things seriously, Ava said. Owen looked at his hands. She raises herself mostly. I just try not to get in the way. Something shifted in Ava's expression. That window again, staying open longer than it usually did. You're not giving yourself enough credit. I'm giving myself exactly enough credit, he said. She's the one who noticed that the salamander connection to spinal research mattered. I just drove her to the library. Ava was quiet for a moment. Then, I want to meet her. I said that before. I mean it. I know you do, he said. The meeting convened at 8 o'clock in the main floor boardroom. Larger than Conference Room B, designed for the full shareholder assembly, rows of chairs facing a long table at the front. Owen wasn't a shareholder. He had no standing in the meeting itself. He stood outside in the corridor with Webb and Reyes and Diana's associate and waited. Holloway arrived with 4 of the 5 remaining board members. Sohan was conspicuously absent, and the absence was itself a statement, the statement of a man whose attorney had told him not to be in the room when certain documents were presented. The institutional shareholder representatives arrived in clusters, serious and unhurried, the collective body language of people who had read the pre-meeting materials Diana had distributed at 5 o'clock and had come with questions. Ava entered the boardroom in her wheelchair. Owen watched her go through the door and noted the deliberateness of it. She had made a decision about that too, and he understood it without having to ask. She wasn't going to make her entrance about standing up. She was going to make it about what she'd built and who had tried to take it from her, and let the rest follow from that. He heard the meeting begin. He couldn't hear the specifics through the door, just the cadence. Holloway's voice, practiced and even, then Diana's voice presenting the documentation, then the particular quality of silence that happens in rooms when people are reading something for the first time and understanding what it means. At 8:43, the door opened and Diana's associate put her head out. She's asking for the clinical team, she said. Webb straightened his jacket. Reyes picked up her folder. Owen stayed where he was. You too, the associate said, looking at him. He went in. The room was full and quiet in the way of rooms where something has shifted. The institutional shareholders were at their tables with the documentation in front of them, and several of them had the specific expression of people who have discovered they were almost party to something they would not have chosen. Holloway was at the far end of the main table with the remaining board members, and his composure was still professional, but it had the quality of something being maintained at cost. Ava was at the head of the table, in her chair, and she was speaking when Owen entered. She was walking the room through the timeline, not emotionally, not dramatically, in the clear, structured way of someone presenting evidence in a format that doesn't require embellishment because the facts are sufficient on their own. The November board meeting proposal, Soan's Series C entry, and the Crestline connection that preceded it by 18 months. The September asset transfer agreement signed before the vote that supposedly authorized the program suspension. The Meridian subsidiary, the warehouse in Newark, the 14 SR7 units promised to the buyer before Ava was told the program was being reviewed. She paused when Owen and Webb and Reyes came in and gestured to the chairs arranged at the side of the room. They sat. I'd like to introduce the clinical team that has been working with me for the past 3 weeks, she said. Dr. Marcus Webb, Dr. Carmen Reyes, and their collaborator Dr. Yoon at Northwestern, who is joining us by video. On the screen at the end of the room, Yoon's face appeared. She had been patched in from Chicago, composed and serious. I'm going to ask Dr. Webb to walk through the clinical findings. Webb stood and presented for 12 minutes. He was clear and precise and didn't oversell anything, which was exactly right. The data didn't need selling, it needed explaining, and he explained it in language that was accessible without being condescending. Voluntary motor response below a thoracic injury classified as functionally complete, documented across multiple sessions, reproducible, outside the parameters of reflex activity by measurable margins. He addressed the board's counter-declaration directly, Voss's argument, and dismantled it with the latency data in the way he'd described to Owen. Unhurried, technical, complete. When he finished, one of the institutional shareholders, a woman in her 50s with the serious, focused energy of someone who managed a significant fund and had not gotten there by accepting things at face value, said, Dr. Webb, to be clear, the treatment protocol that produced these results was the same protocol the board suspended in October. The same protocol, Webb said, designed by Dr. Reyes and her team over 4 years. The equipment required to implement it was removed from the building before the formal suspension vote and transferred through a subsidiary connected to the acquiring company. The room was very quiet. Ms. Sinclair, the woman said, turning to Ava, you were not informed of the equipment transfer. I was told the program was under budget review, Ava said. I was not informed that the equipment had been promised to Crestline Medical before the board held the vote to suspend the program. I was not informed that the company reviewing the acquisition had a financial connection to 2 of the board members who authorized the transfer. Holloway said, These are allegations without Mr. Holloway. The institutional shareholder's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. You'll have the opportunity to respond. At the moment, I'm asking Ms. Sinclair questions. Holloway closed his mouth. There's a document I haven't presented yet, Ava said. She looked at Diana, who distributed copies to each shareholder table, the November board meeting transcript, the strategic partnership proposal, Holloway's motion, and Ava's recorded objection. 14 months before the accident, 8 months before Mr. Sohn introduced the Crestline inquiry, the motion was made, I voted it down, and the board moved on. She paused. What I didn't understand at the time was that moving on meant finding a different approach. The room took a moment with that. Holloway said, carefully, the board's position was always, Mr. Holloway. This time it was a different shareholder. Older, male, the kind of quiet that came from a long time of not needing volume to be heard. I've been a shareholder in this company for 6 years. I invested in this company specifically because of the research program Ms. Sinclair was building. The program that your board suspended, using equipment that had apparently already been sold to a competitor, after an acquisition proposal that Miss Sinclair had previously refused. He paused. I'd like to hear your explanation for the September asset transfer agreement before I hear your position on anything else. Holloway looked at his attorney. His attorney leaned forward and said something quiet. Holloway straightened. The board authorized the program suspension in October, Owen said. The room turned. He hadn't planned to speak. He'd planned to sit against the wall and let the documentation do its work. But Holloway's framing was already starting to blur the timeline, and he wasn't going to let it. The asset transfer agreement is dated September 14th, Owen said. The board vote to suspend the program was October 2nd. The equipment was moved out of the building the weekend of October 12th, and the formal decommission notation went into the maintenance logs on October 29th. He looked at Holloway directly. The board authorized the suspension in October. The equipment was promised to Crestline in September. Those aren't the same event. Holloway looked at him with the expression Owen had seen the first morning, the combination of offense and calculation. You're a maintenance supervisor. I'm the person who noticed $300,000 in medical hardware had disappeared from the building without a destination record, Owen said, and then found it in a warehouse owned by a subsidiary of the company that was planning to buy this one. He kept his voice even. The authorization timeline is in the documentation. It doesn't require my interpretation. The quiet that followed had a different texture than the quiet before it. The institutional shareholder, the woman who had been asking the questions, looked at Holloway for a moment, then looked back at the documents, then looked at Ava. Ms. Sinclair, what is your position on the vote this evening? Ava had been waiting for this. Owen could see it in the way she sat, the stillness that was not passivity but readiness. She reached to the side of her chair and picked up the robotic braces from where they'd been resting. She'd had them off, he realized, the entire meeting, had come in her chair because she'd chosen to make the case first on the merits and let the physical piece follow. And she said, I'd like to stand for this part, if you'll give me a moment. Webb was at her side immediately, helping fit the braces with the practiced efficiency of 3 weeks of sessions. It took 4 minutes. The room watched in the silence of people who understand they are observing something that they will not have words for immediately after. When Ava stood, it was not effortless. It was not theatrical. She came upright from her chair slowly, both hands on the table, the braces doing their portion and her legs doing theirs, and she stood at the head of the table at her full height for the first time in 14 months, in a room full of people who had voted or been prepared to vote on the question of whether she was capable of leading anything. She didn't make a speech about it. She just stood there for a moment and let the room understand what it was looking at. Then she said, My position is that the vote to remove me should be withdrawn, that Mr. Holloway and Mr. Sowan should be removed from the board pending the legal review Diana Cho's office is initiating, and that the Phase 2 Rehabilitation Research Program should be reinstated with full funding and the return of the misappropriated equipment. She paused. That's what I'm asking the shareholders to authorize tonight. The vote wasn't close. It wasn't the unanimous sweep of a movie. 2 of the institutional shareholders abstained pending further legal review, which Diana said afterward was actually a reasonable outcome given the timeline. But the motion to remove Ava failed with a clear majority. Holloway and 3 of the remaining board members were formally suspended pending investigation, and the Phase 2 program was reinstated by the same meeting that had been called to bury it. Holloway left the room without speaking. Sowan, Owen learned later, had been served with documentation at his home that evening, his attorney already managing the situation. The machinery of consequences moved slowly, but it moved, which was sometimes the best you could ask. Owen found Ava in the corridor afterward, Webb and Reyes on either side of her, the braces back off, and her chair beneath her because standing for 45 minutes in a boardroom was a significant physical effort, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She was tired in the visible way she rarely allowed, not defeated, the opposite, the exhaustion of someone who has spent everything they had on something that mattered and found it was enough. She looked up when Owen came through the door and held his gaze, and there were no words for the first moment, which was fine, because some things don't need words to be understood between people who have spent 3 weeks building something out of what everyone else had decided was wreckage. 3 seconds, she said finally. He looked at her. What? That morning in the clinical suite, when my feet cleared the platform. She paused. You said it would be enough. That proof the pathways existed would be enough. She looked at him steadily. You were right. He nodded. You're usually right, she said. It's mildly irritating. I know, he said. You'll get used to it. She looked at him for a moment more, and then the careful management of her expression did the thing it had been doing more often recently, gave way to something that didn't need managing, something that was simply there, uncurated and real, in the corridor of a building she had built and almost lost and taken back. Rhea said from a diplomatic distance, I'm going to find coffee. Webb, come find coffee. Webb said, I don't actually want, and then registered Rhea's expression and said, Coffee, yes, great idea. They left Owen and Ava in the corridor, and the building made its ordinary sounds around them. The elevator down the hall, a phone somewhere, the hum of a building that didn't pause for significance. And he sat in the chair against the wall beside her, the way he'd taken to doing, and for a while they were both quiet, and the quiet was the comfortable kind that doesn't require filling. The morning after the shareholder meeting, Owen went to work. Not because there was nothing else to do. There was plenty else to do, and his phone had been active since 6 with messages from Diana's office, from Reyes, from Webb, from the hospital administrator who had somehow heard about the previous evening and wanted a conversation. He went to work because his crew had a valve replacement scheduled in the East Wing, and Darius had a tendency to cross-thread fittings when left unsupervised, and because the building didn't pause for significant evenings, and neither did Owen Mercer. He was under a utility sink in the third-floor supply room when his phone rang with Ava's number. He answered it with one hand, wrench still in the other. You're at work, she said. It wasn't a question. Valve replacement. A brief pause. I called to tell you that Soan's attorney contacted Diana this morning. He's cooperating with the investigation in exchange for a reduced civil exposure arrangement, which means the full documentation trail on the Crestline deal is now available without subpoena. Another pause. Holloway is fighting it. His attorney filed a response to the injunction proceeding that describes the whole thing as a coordinated smear campaign. A pause, dry. He used the phrase orchestrated by disgruntled former employees and a facilities worker. Owen looked at the wrench in his hand. That's accurate technically. I thought you'd appreciate that. A beat. Diana says it doesn't matter. The asset transfer documentation speaks for itself, and Soan's cooperation fills in the gaps we couldn't establish from records alone. The board seats have been formally vacated pending the legal proceeding. We'll have an emergency governance session next week to seat interim replacements while the full board restructuring is processed. Are you doing okay? He asked. The pause this time was different from the business pauses. I slept 9 hours, she said, like it was a confession. I can't remember the last time I slept 9 hours. Good, he said. It felt strange, like I'd forgotten how. A pause. Owen, I want to talk to you about something. Not right now. You're clearly under a sink, but tonight, if you're free. I can be free, he said. He finished the valve replacement, corrected Darius's fitting on the secondary line without comment, and spent the afternoon moving through his normal rounds with the specific sensation of someone walking a familiar route, the day after something has permanently changed and finding that the route looks the same while knowing it isn't. The hospital was the same building it had been a month ago. The maintenance corridors, the equipment bays, the HVAC intakes. He still checked every week. Same building, different weight to it. He picked up Lily from school at 3:15, and she came out the front doors in a rush, backpack half open, and said, We did a project on ecosystems, and I told my class about axolotls, and Mrs. Kaplan said I could do my science fair project on regenerative biology. Without pausing for breath, and Owen caught the backpack zipper before it fell open completely and said, That's a big topic for a science fair. I know, Lily said. That's why it's good. He made dinner, helped with the first draft of a science fair proposal that was ambitious beyond the available timeline, but not dishonestly so. And at 7:15 dropped Lily at the Hendersons with her salamander book and her pajamas and the specific trust she had in her father that when he said he'd be back by 9, he meant it. He met Ava at the small Italian place 3 blocks from the hospital that he'd noticed every day for 14 months and never been inside. She was already there when he arrived, at a corner table, and she was in her chair because the robotic braces were a clinical tool, not a daily living solution yet, and she had made peace with that distinction without requiring anyone to make a production of it. She looked different from the previous evening. The exhaustion was still there but had been slept on, and what remained was something quieter and less defended. "I ordered water," she said when he sat. "I didn't know what you drink." "Water is fine," he said. "What did you want to talk about?" She looked at him for a moment. She had the expression of someone who has prepared something and is now deciding whether the preparation was the right approach. "I want to offer you a position," she said. "Formally. Chief Operations Officer. I'm not doing this because of what you did in the past 3 weeks, though that's part of it. I'm doing it because I need someone running operations who understands what the company is actually building and will protect the work, not the margins." She paused. "You have the operational background. You spent a month proving you understand the research well enough to explain it in a boardroom. And you have a quality I found it very difficult to hire for." She paused, choosing. "You don't need the credit for things to matter to you." Owen looked at her across the table. "I fix pipes." "You also rebuilt a scattered research team in 5 days, found evidence of corporate fraud through maintenance logs, and changed the trajectory of a boardroom vote by standing in the right place at the right time." She met his gaze. "The pipes are a relatively small part of your skill set. The pay difference would be significant," he said. Not as a condition, just as a fact he was processing. "Yes," she said, "it would be." He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant was not crowded. A Tuesday, mid-November, a few other tables occupied. Ordinary people having ordinary evenings, which was its own kind of good thing to be surrounded by. "I'd want to stay connected to the rehabilitation program," he said. "Not as a clinician, I know what I'm not, but the operational side. Procurement, logistics, facility requirements for the full protocol rollout. That's the work that matters." "That would be the core of the role," she said. "The Phase 2 program is being reinstated with full funding. We're planning a facility expansion, a dedicated rehabilitation center designed around the protocol. That's an 18-month project from ground up, if we move efficiently." She paused. "I'd want you running that." He looked at her. "You've thought about this for more than a day." "I've thought about it since the Thursday video call," she said. "When you sat at your kitchen table at 11 at night coordinating 3 scientists across 3 time zones and then went to work the next morning and replaced a pipe." She held his gaze. "I know what it looks like when someone is doing the right work in the wrong place." He was quiet for a moment more. The decision wasn't difficult, which was sometimes the sign of a right answer and sometimes the sign of an impulsive one. He'd learned to tell the difference. This felt like the former. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Not effusive about it. Just settled. The way 2 people agree on something that was always going to happen and are both relieved to have stopped going around it. They ate dinner and talked about the facility expansion and then about other things. About Lily's science fair project, which Ava knew more about than Owen did in terms of the actual biology. About the city they both lived in and had apparently been navigating in proximity for longer than either had realized. About the particular quality of work that feels like it belongs to you rather than something you're doing to fill the hours. The conversation moved the way conversations move when 2 people have already been through something together and the ordinary stuff no longer requires the careful scaffolding of strangers. He drove home through the city at 9 o'clock and picked up Lily, who was asleep on the Hendersons' couch, with her salamander book open on her chest, and carried her to the truck without waking her, the way he'd been doing since she was small enough to fit in one arm. She stirred when he buckled her seatbelt and said, without fully waking, "Did you have dinner with the lady?" "I did," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to sleep. The following year moved the way significant years do. Not smoothly, not without cost, but with the specific momentum of things that have found their direction and are no longer fighting themselves. The legal proceedings against Holloway and so on took 8 months to resolve. Holloway's attorney was skilled, and the process was not simple, But Soan's cooperation had provided the foundation Diana needed, and the civil judgment that came down in July held both men liable for breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent asset transfer. The 14 SR-7 units were returned from the Newark warehouse in February in the specific condition of equipment that has been stored by people who didn't know what it was worth. Webb's technicians spent a week recalibrating them. All 14 were functional. The Crestline acquisition inquiry was formally withdrawn in March, which Ava said she'd known would happen once the legal exposure became clear, and which Owen noted without saying anything was also around the time 2 of Crestline's board members had quietly resigned from their positions. The Phase 2 program reopened in January with 6 patients in the initial cohort, each of them carrying some version of the story Ava carried: spinal injury, acute treatment, classification as functionally complete, the specific grief of being told that the best available medicine had reached its limit with you. Webb and Reyes ran the protocol. Yoon flew in from Chicago for the first month to ensure the implementation matched the research design. Owen managed procurement and logistics and facility coordination with the particular attention to detail of someone who had learned, in a previous life, that the difference between a mission succeeding and failing was usually in the preparation that nobody saw. The first patient in the cohort to show voluntary motor response was a 32-year-old former high school football coach named Gerald, whose injury had been 18 months prior and who had 2 kids under 10 and a wife who drove 3 hours each way for every session. The response came in week 4, right quadricep, slight but reproducible, and Webb called Owen from the clinical suite at 8 in the evening and said, "It's working," in a voice that still, after all of it, hadn't gotten used to saying it. Owen was at his desk in the new operational office on the 6th floor, a room with a window that faced east, which he'd chosen because he liked the morning light. And he sat for a moment with the phone against his ear and thought about Gerald's kids, who were probably doing homework right now, or fighting over the remote, or doing the ordinary, irreplaceable things that children do when their father is still in the world and present in it. "Good," he said, and then, "Keep going." Ava's own rehabilitation continued through the year in parallel with the clinical program, which she had insisted on, not as a flagship patient, not as a demonstration case, but as someone receiving the same protocol as the other 6, on the same schedule, held to the same standards. She worked with Webb 3 mornings a week, and the other mornings she ran the company, which she did from her office or the conference rooms or wherever the work required, in her chair on the days the braces weren't warranted, and in the braces on the days they were, without making a public distinction between them because she didn't feel one needed to be made. By April, she could walk the length of the clinical suite with the braces and one hand on the parallel bar. By June, she walked it without the bar. By August, she was navigating the company hallways with the braces and a single forearm crutch on difficult days, and without it on easier ones, and the staff had stopped watching her do it. Not because they'd stopped caring, but because it had become ordinary, which was the best possible outcome. She still used her chair for long days and high-demand situations. She probably always would. She had stopped framing this as a limitation sometime around March, in a conversation with Reyes after a long session, when she'd said, "I think I spent a long time believing that partial wasn't enough." And Reyes had looked at her and said, "Partial got the company back. Partial reopened the program. What exactly is partial failing to do?" And Ava hadn't had an answer, which was itself the answer. Owen watched her move through the building on an ordinary Wednesday in September, cutting across the main floor to a meeting, braces visible below her slacks, talking to a staff member while she moved, not slowing for either task, and thought that the version of her he'd seen in the conference room 13 months ago, still with the pen in her hand, would not have recognized this particular stride. Not the physical fact of it, the quality of it. The way she moved like someone who owned the floor she was walking on, not because it was easy, but because she had decided it was hers. He went back to his desk and the 17 things on it that needed handling before end of day. The rehabilitation center broke ground in October on a site 12 minutes from the hospital, a piece of land Ava had identified in the spring, and Owen had spent 3 months navigating through permits and contractors and the specific bureaucratic friction of building something new in a city that had very detailed opinions about what new things should look like. The architect was a woman named Solis, who had designed 3 other medical facilities and who understood immediately what Ava meant when she said she wanted the building to feel like a place people came to work, not a place they came to be managed. The groundbreaking was a small ceremony. Staff, the clinical team, a few shareholders, the first cohort of patients. Gerald was there with his wife and his kids, who were more interested in the construction equipment than the speeches, which Owen felt was entirely appropriate. Reyes flew in from Portland. Yoon drove down from Chicago. Webb, who had been in the city full-time since January and had rented an apartment 6 blocks from the hospital, stood beside Owen at the edge of the ceremony with his hands in his jacket pockets and said, "I thought about this, back in January when I was in Asheville, whether it was worth coming back to something that had been shut down and burned." "And?" Owen said. Webb was quiet for a moment. "Gerald's kids," he said. "The little one, the 6-year-old. She climbed into her dad's lap the morning after the first voluntary response. Just climbed up and sat there while he was in the chair doing post-session monitoring, like it was the most natural thing." He paused. "That's the answer. That's always the answer." Owen nodded. He'd learned that you didn't argue with that kind of answer or try to make it more complicated. It was what it was. Sometimes the reason to do something difficult is that simple, and the simplicity is the point. The ceremony wrapped as the light went flat and gray in the way of autumn afternoons, and people dispersed in groups toward the parking lot, and Owen was helping Reyes load her materials into her rental car when Lily appeared at his elbow with a paper cup of hot chocolate that she had obtained from somewhere and was drinking with the self-sufficient air of a child who doesn't need supervision at events. "The building's going to be big," she said, looking at the construction site. "Pretty big," Owen said. 3 floors and a therapy garden." "Can they put an aquarium in the waiting room?" she said. "With axolotls, for the patients to look at while they wait. It would be educational and also calming." Owen looked at his daughter. She was 9 now, had turned 9 in July, with a birthday party at the aquarium that had started as Ava's idea, and that Owen had spent 2 weeks pretending he could have organized without her help. She was wearing her good jacket and a salamander pin she'd made herself from a kit, and she had the specific expression of a child who has thought of a genuinely good idea and is watching to see if the adults around her will recognize it. "That's not a bad idea," Reyes said seriously, from the other side of the car. "I'll put it in the facility planning document," Owen said. Lily nodded, satisfied, and went to find Ava. He watched her cross the parking lot, weaving between adults with the confident navigation of a child who has been brought to enough grown-up events to know how to move through them, and find Ava near the construction fence, where Ava was looking at the site layout with Solis and pointing at something Owen couldn't see from this distance. Lily stopped beside Ava's chair and said something. Ava looked down and said something back. Lily laughed. It had happened gradually, the way significant things do when you're not watching for them. The first time they'd met had been awkward in the specific way of a child encountering a parent's colleague, who is clearly more than a colleague but hasn't been named as such yet. And Lily had handled it with the directness of an 8-year-old who had asked Ava within the first 10 minutes whether she'd ever seen a real axolotl. Ava had said she hadn't, only photographs for the research, and Lily had said the aquarium downtown had them and they could go. And Owen had started to say something about making plans, and Lily had looked at him with the patient expression of a 9-year-old managing a slow adult and said, "I'm inviting her, Dad." They'd gone to the aquarium on a Saturday in March. The 3 of them. Lily had narrated the entire aquarium experience with the enthusiasm of someone who had been preparing for this specific tour for months, and Ava had asked genuine questions. Not the polite questions adults ask children, but actual questions, the kind that led to longer answers, the kind that showed the information mattered. And Owen had walked behind them and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized as the specific weight of a thing you'd been quietly hoping for, but hadn't let yourself name. By summer, Lily had taken to calling Ava by her first name without ceremony, which Ava had told Owen she preferred, and which Owen had decided not to make complicated. Some things sorted themselves when you didn't interfere with them. The center opened the following spring, on an April morning when the light came in from the east and hit the main entrance glass, and did the thing that Solis had promised it would do with that particular angle of exposure. Filled the lobby with something warm and directional that made the space feel intentional without being showy. The name on the building was the Meridian Recovery Center, which Ava had proposed, and which Owen had initially found ironic given the Meridian Asset Solutions connection, until she'd explained that she'd chosen it because she wanted to reclaim the word. Meridian meaning highest point, the peak of an arc, the moment before descent becomes ascent. He'd stopped arguing with her naming decisions after the third one turned out to be exactly right. The opening ceremony was larger than the groundbreaking. Staff from all 3 floors, the full clinical team, the first cohort's patients, plus the second cohort, who were 6 weeks into their protocols, press from 2 medical publications and a city newspaper, and the kind of gathered quiet that happens when a room full of people understands it is marking something real. Ava spoke first. She stood at the podium with the braces and without the crutch, which she'd stopped needing outside of high-demand days in February, and she spoke about what the center was for in the same clear, structured way she'd walked the shareholders through a document on the most important night of her company's life. Without performance, without the inspirational vocabulary that makes people feel moved in the moment and remember nothing afterward. She talked about the 14 months she'd spent in a wheelchair, being told the best answer medicine had for her was acceptance. She talked about the protocol that had been built in a warehouse of a research division and nearly buried by the people who were supposed to protect it. She talked about what it meant to stand in a room full of people who had made decisions about your capability and find out that the decision had been wrong, and what it cost to be the person who had believed them for a while, and what it took to stop. She didn't name Owen in the speech. She told him she wasn't going to, which had been his preference, and she'd agreed without making him explain why, which told him she understood. He was standing at the side of the room with Webb and Reyes and Lily, who was taking the event seriously enough to have worn the good jacket again, and he listened to the speech and thought about the morning 13 months ago when he'd stood in a corridor and heard the quality of a room where something was wrong and pushed open a door. He thought about what it would have meant to keep walking. There was a moment, somewhere after Ava sat and before the facility tour, when Gerald's 6-year-old climbed up onto the chair beside Lily and asked about the salamander pin, and Lily launched into an explanation of regenerative biology that was both accurate and completely accessible to a 6-year-old, and Gerald, standing nearby with his wife's hand in his, caught Owen's eye across the room with the expression of a man who was still learning what it meant to have more days. Owen nodded. Gerald nodded back. No words required. After the ceremony wound down and the tours were done, and the room had emptied to its last clusters of people finishing conversations and gathering coats, Owen found himself in the main corridor of the center's first floor, the recovery wing, where the therapy suites were, where the work would happen. The corridor was quiet now, all the machines powered down for the ceremony day, the equipment waiting. It smelled like new construction and something antiseptic, and underneath that, if you knew what you were looking for, it smelled like the possibility of something that hadn't happened yet. He heard the soft sound of Ava's braces on the floor before he saw her. She came around the corner from the lobby and stopped when she saw him, then continued toward him at the unhurried pace she'd developed. Not slow, not a compensation, just the specific cadence of someone who has learned to move sustainably rather than by force. "People are looking for you," she said. "I needed 5 minutes," he said. She stopped beside him and looked down the corridor, the therapy suite doors, the clean empty line of the hallway. "I keep thinking about what this looked like 8 months ago," she said. "Just a construction drawing, a line on paper that said, 'This is where the parallel bars go.'" "You planned the parallel bars yourself," he said, "down to the exact height settings." "I knew what the right heights were," she said. 14 months of using them." He looked at her profile, the careful line of her jaw, the way she held herself that was both the physical work of the braces and the older habit of not asking for more support than she needed. He thought about the pen on the conference table 13 months ago, and the folder in his hand, and the particular stubbornness that had made him push the door open instead of walking past. He thought about his crew downstairs at the hospital right now, Darius probably cross-threading something again, Pat reading her crossword in the break room. The building he'd left this morning and might be returning to in some form or another, in a different role, because the COO job was real and the work was real, and he'd spent 6 months learning the shape of it, but you didn't stop knowing how a building worked just because your title changed. I want to ask you something, he said. She turned to look at him. He hadn't prepared it, which was probably the right choice. He'd tried to prepare it once in April, and the preparation had made it sound like a proposal, and he'd decided that when the moment was right, he'd know it, and would trust himself not to wreck it by overthinking the language. He looked at her steadily, the way you look at someone when you want them to know you mean the specific thing you're about to say, and not a managed version of it. I want to ask you to marry me, he said, not because of any of this, not because of what we built, though that's part of who I know you are now, because of the parking lot. Because you told me you'd had 3 sessions a week every week for 14 months, because it was the only fight that still felt like yours. Because you were still fighting when everyone in your life had given you reasons not to. He paused. I want to do the rest of this with you, whatever the rest of this turns out to be. Ava looked at him. He watched her face do the thing it used to do, the move toward management, toward the careful arrangement of her expression, and then stop and let what was underneath just be there. She said, Owen, I want to point out that you are proposing in an empty hospital corridor. I know, he said. You can choose to be bothered by that, or you can consider that it's consistent with how everything between us has happened. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved through her expression. Not the complicated architecture of a decision, just something clean and sure that had been there for a while and didn't need convincing. The first morning, she said, when you put that folder on the table, I thought, who is this person? Why does this matter to him? It mattered because the room was wrong, he said. That's not why, she said. That's what you said. It's not the same thing. She held his gaze. The reason it mattered to you is because you are someone for whom things matter. That's rarer than it sounds. A pause. I've spent a lot of my life in rooms full of people who had decided what things were worth. You walked into a room and decided something was worth fighting for before you knew what it was. She paused. That's the answer, if you want one. That's not a yes, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He hadn't thought about the ring, which he was aware was a significant practical oversight, and he said so, and she said she didn't want a ring right now. She wanted to tell Lily first and do it in that order, which was correct, and which he had also not thought of, and he said, she's going to want a salamander cake. I've already been in contact with a bakery about a salamander cake, Ava said. He looked at her. Since when? March, she said. He thought about March, the aquarium, the Saturday morning, Lily's immediate and unselfconscious invitation. He thought about what it meant to have been the last person in a 3-person arrangement to understand that it had already decided its own shape. You're mildly terrifying, he said. I run a medical technology company, she said. Terrifying is efficient. They went back to the lobby together, where Lily was explaining axolotl neurobiology to the increasingly attentive 6-year-old, and Webb was trying to convince Reyes that the facility cafeteria needed better coffee before the first patient cohort moved in, and Yoon was looking at the center's layout plans with Solis and asking questions that would probably result in a design modification, and the new board members were clustered near the entrance talking about the expansion roadmap for the second facility in Boston that was currently a line on a proposal and would be, if the next 18 months went the way Owen's operational projections suggested, a building. Lily looked up what they approached with the instinctive radar of a child who monitors her parents' emotional state as a matter of habit and survival, and she registered something in the way Owen and Ava were standing, the particular proximity of 2 people who have just decided something, and her eyes went between them twice before she said, with the characteristic directness of a 9-year-old who has very little patience for adults taking a long time to get to the point. Did something happen? Something happened, Owen said. Lily looked at Ava. Ava looked at Lily. Some communication occurred between them that Owen didn't have full access to, the specific frequency of 2 people who had built their own understanding over 14 months of aquariums and clinic corridors and Saturday mornings and salamander biology. Then Lily said, I already told her yes about the salamander cake, by the way, and went back to her conversation with the 6-year-old. Owen looked at Ava. Ava was doing the thing that wasn't quite a laugh, except today it was actually a laugh. quiet, unguarded, the laugh of someone who has been found out by a 9-year-old and is choosing to find it funny rather than undignified. He thought about the story he'd be able to tell someday. The folder, the conference room, the pen on the table, the missing hardware, the scattered team, the corridor at midnight when Reyes called with the transfer agreement, the 6-hour delay that became a different evening than it was supposed to be, the 3 seconds when Ava's feet cleared the platform for the first time in 14 months, the empty hallway of a new building that smelled like possibility. He thought about how none of it had been planned, none of it had been smooth, and almost all of it had happened because someone had noticed something wrong and decided that noticing wasn't enough. He thought about what it cost to not walk past. Because that's the thing about these kinds of moments, the ones where a door is open and a room is wrong and you have a folder in your hand and somewhere to be. Most people keep walking, not because they don't care, and not because they're bad people. Because caring costs something, and the cost is real, and the outcome isn't guaranteed, and the world doesn't give you credit for trying when the try doesn't work out. Owen Mercer had walked past plenty of things in his life that he wished he'd stopped for. He'd learned that list by heart, the way you learn the things you can't go back and change. And he'd learned that you couldn't live inside the regret of it. You could only use it as a compass for the next time a corridor is quiet and a room is wrong, and you have a choice about whether your feet keep moving. Lily was talking. Webb was arguing about coffee. The building was full of people who had shown up for something that mattered, most of them tired in the way of people who have worked hard at a real thing, none of them perfect, all of them present. His daughter caught his eye across the lobby and gave him the specific look she reserved for moments when she was satisfied with how things had turned out. The look of a 9-year-old who had been paying close attention to the world and found it occasionally, improbably, worth the attention. He gave her the look back. She returned to the 6-year-old and the axolotls. Outside, through the lobby glass, the April light was doing what April light does in the late afternoon, going gold and long-angled, hitting surfaces at the kind of angle that makes ordinary things look considered. The construction equipment that had built the center was gone now, moved to the next site or the one after that, building other things for other purposes, indifferent to what had been made here. The building stood as it was, not a monument, not a symbol, just a place where work would happen, where people would come who had been told the last thing they would hear and would find out that wasn't true. The story didn't end with everyone healed. Gerald still had hard days, mornings when the voluntary response was slower and the progress felt less certain, and the drive home took everything he had. 2 patients in the second cohort were progressing more slowly than the protocol predicted, which Webb said was within the expected variance, and which Reyes was adjusting for, and which was still, on the difficult days, its own kind of grief. Ava would wear the braces for the foreseeable future on the days that required them, and had stopped keeping track of which days those were, because keeping track meant organizing your life around a deficit, and she had other things to organize her life around now. Owen still woke up at 5:50 some mornings with the particular alertness of someone who spent a decade being responsible for other people in high-stakes situations, and whose nervous system hadn't entirely gotten the memo that things were quieter now. He still sometimes sat in his truck in a parking lot and thought about the list of things he'd walked past. He still, on the bad sleep nights, carried the weight of his daughter's early years without her mother. The years he'd been too tired and too hollowed out to be all of what she needed, and he hoped he'd done enough to make up the ground. But Lily was 9 and fine and deeply interested in salamanders, and was going to be difficult and brilliant and entirely herself in the specific way that children are when someone has paid attention to who they actually are, and that was the truest measure Owen had of whether he'd done the thing right. Strength wasn't the absence of damage. He'd known that since the collarbone, since the years in the field, since the specific education of watching people in bad situations find out what they were made of. Strength was what you did when the weight was real and the outcome wasn't certain, and you had a choice about whether to keep moving or put the folder on the table and say, "Sign mine first." The building held the light for another few minutes, the way new buildings do before the angle shifts and the ordinary settles back in. Then the lobby doors opened, and Owen Mercer went back inside.